Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, all the honorable guests, all the players, and everyone who is watching our live seminar right now. My name is Tak Pipu, and I'll be your host for today, and perhaps tomorrow as well. So please don't get sick of me so easily. Anyhow, please allow me to introduce you to our virtual seminar, Recharging Asia Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Development Amidst Post-Pandemic World, organized by ITD, or the International Institute for Trade and Development. As we all know already, ladies and gentlemen, COVID-19 has been shaking our world for almost 2 years, and our life has never been the same. As we all know, we now can no longer travel safely or freely as usual. Our children have to stay at home instead of going to school and socialize with all their friends. And unfortunately, all the businesses in this world, more than 80% are affected by the virus, and they are now closing down in every minute. Therefore, today, we are going to find some solutions, some guidance, and some policy from the knowledge of all the experts so that we can bring us all throughout this kind of unpredictable situation. But first of all, ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to meet the executive board member of the ITD who would like to welcome you all with a very lovely, warm, welcoming remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Silaporn Buasai.
Thank you. Mr. Richard Baldwin, Head of Investment Research Branch, Division on Investment and Enterprise, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Excellencies, distinguished participants, on behalf of the Executive Board member of the International Institute for Trade and Development, or ITD, it is my great honor to give you a warm welcome to our Trade and Development Regional Forum 2021. With the theme of inclusive growth and sustainable development amidst post-pandemic world, which is held from 24 to 26 of August 2021 in virtual platform. As many of you may have known, ITD was established as a result following the 10th session of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, held in Bangkok in February 2000. That was 2.5 years after the economic crisis in 1997. The Bangkok Declaration of Member States of UNCTAD then stated the situation in the post-crisis context as follows. The 10th United Nations Conference on Trade and Development took place in a country and a region that were at the center of one of the most severe financial and economic crises of recent times, which had an adverse effect on almost developing countries. Despite that, within a relatively short period, through various national responses and with the cooperation of the international community, The countries concerned have been able to meet the challenge of resuming growth and are now emerging from the crisis with a renewed sense of confidence. This demonstrates the power of human spirit when it mobilizes collective efforts to address the challenges of globalization. One of the most important events following that conference was the unique agreement between UNCTAD and the Royal Thai government to establish an International Institute for Trade and Development to provide technical assistance and training for developing nations. And 1 year later, ITD was established. Distinguished participants, 20 years have passed since then. The world has become more interdependent, and digital technology and logistics has transformed the world into a real global community where every country participates in the global value chains. From an economic perspective, the global economy has experienced a decent growth, and development pays more attention to a more holistic dimension of green and inclusive economic development. Sustainable development goals have become the challenge of all nations to achieve by 2030. But as history tends to repeat itself, the cycle of crisis has revisited us again since 2019, when the world was hit by COVID-19. Unlike previous economic crises, this one sprung from a health crisis and the worst in a century, one that transformed into an economic and political crisis in many countries and is still far from over. No country can escape the ordeal of this pandemic. This proves that the interconnectedness and interdependence among countries are very real. And the solutions lie in the knowledge and innovation based on humanitarian approach and collective efforts among nations. Since the establishment of the International Institute for Trade and Development, ITD has performed its role as a research and training institute for capacity building of trade personnel in Asian countries to enhance efficiency in trade facilitation in congruence with the Free Trade Area Agreement and globalization. ITD also supports regional economic cooperation through knowledge sharing among developing countries in Asia. Convening regional forum is an instrument. ITD used to exchange knowledge, experience, evidence, views concerning the advance of trade and development. Distinguished participants, the forum this year is more meaningful than ever because of two main reasons. Firstly, it is our 20th anniversary of ITD. Secondly, it is held amidst one of the worst economic crises again. Prior to the pandemic, most countries in Asia rely considerably on tourism and service sector for income and contribution to their GDPs. However, as the pandemic struck, international travel halted and tourism disrupted, export has become the hope and last resort for many countries to bring in money and make way for economic development. Before the pandemic subsides, I expect that trade and investment will be the name of the game. Therefore, this year, Trade and Development Regional Forum is designed to address the issue of post-COVID economic recovery, particularly the situation, trend, coping strategies, and solutions in international trade and development and investment to rebuild sustainable economic and social development while leaving no one behind. These solutions will be discussed in different keynote speech, panel discussions, and presentations. In today's sessions, Mr. Richard Baldwin will discuss the key investment trends which are impacted by the spread of COVID-19 and different economic policies from different regions, and also present key findings of the World Investment Report 2021. Next will be 3 presentations of Commission papers. The first one on international investment agreement reform in Thailand. The second one is the impact of COVID-19 on supply chain disruptions in Asia Pacific. And the third one is on the e-commerce in India and Japan. Last but not least, a panel discussion on how different countries or regions, namely the EU, the United States, China, and India, build their resilience in trade and investment activities during the pandemic crisis. Distinguished participants, I strongly believe that the Trade and Development Regional Forum 2021 will be valuable learning platform for all of us. I also would like to thank UNCTAD, WTO, UNESCAP, the ASEAN Secretariat, and other public and private organizations, both in Thailand and foreign countries, who collaborate and support the organization of this regional forum. I hope that all participants take away, at the end of the day, things you have not known before or have not thought of before, as well as enlarge your perspective on trade and development issues. To this, I would like to welcome you and thank all honorable speakers for sharing your valuable knowledge and experience in this ITD's regional forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Silaprawn, for the welcoming remarks. Couldn't agree more that no country in this world can run away or avoid from this pandemic, and no country can survive alone in the long term. But ladies and gentlemen, my beloved participants, before we're going to start our session and meet the first speaker, I would like you all to know more and learn more about the ITD. So please enjoy this video.
Amidst the economic changes and the rise of digital technology and innovations in the world today, countries are more connected than ever before. The world that used to be big has become smaller as innovations created by human beings have created a society without borders, where knowledge transfer is no longer limited to an exclusive group of individuals and access to information can be done in a matter of seconds. During the 10th session of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD 10, one of the meeting's agreements was to set up an institution for trade and development in this region, where soon after, the Royal Thai government and UNCTAD came together and signed a cooperation agreement in establishing the International Institute for Trade and Development, or ITD, here in Thailand. ITD is a public organization under the Ministry of Commerce that has been in operation since May 1, 2002, as a certified academic institution trusted by UNCTAD. The goal of ITD is to become a leading organization that manages platforms and provides consultations to Asian countries to promote and strengthen international trade and development within the region, and bring economic growth and prosperity to underdeveloped and developing countries in Asia. ITD has 4 key missions. 1. To enhance the capacity building of developing countries in the region and sub-region by imposing an economic policy and regulation law. 2. To organize training and research in the field of international trade and development in order to develop human resources in the region and sub-region. 3. To support the cooperation on regional economic integration through exchanging of experiences and knowledge. 4. To be the center of training and additional activities in the field of international trade and development with UNCTAD and related organizations. ITD has been working closely with leading domestic and international government institutes and private corporations to organize activities, workshops, conferences, and seminars to educate and publicize essential trade and development issues to the public. ITD is responsible for the research and publication of various useful open source studies regarding trade and development in this region. For over 20 years, ITD has been committed to overcoming all the challenges, and now we are ready to move forward while continuing to provide you with reliable, up-to-date academic knowledge to broaden your horizons.
And that was ITD Dust. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to begin our session today. Time to begin to do what is to recharge our regional, Recharging Asia. Our first speaker today, he is the head of Investment Research Branch, Division on Investment and Enterprise of UNCTAD. He will be bringing us to see what measures every country should adopt in order to rejuvenate the global economy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Richard Baldwin.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. And let me start by congratulating Mrs. Boisai and ITD friends and colleagues on their anniversary. We have, well, a 20-year relationship between UNCTAD and ITD. On the program, you will have Dr. Supachai, a former Secretary General of UNCTAD, and our current acting Secretary General speaking later. Speaking for my division, the investment division in UNCTAD, we very much appreciate the collaboration over the years, and especially the collaboration related to the launch and dissemination and training on the findings of our annual World Investment Reports. Those World Investment Reports will also be the basis of my talk today at the start of this forum. You see on your screen already, or I see on my screen already, the opening slide of my presentation, and you see there the title that I have been given to talk to. Investment reshoring, how to rejuvenate the global economy and trade policy in the post-COVID-19 environment, and what steps and measures can countries take. So quite a mouthful, a very long title. I will base my discussion on not just this year's World Investment Report, which has the title Investing in Sustainable Recovery, because it provides very much the short-term view on what to do in the post-COVID-19 environment. But because there is also parts of the title talking about investment reshoring and trade policy, I will also mix in the findings from the World Investment Report of 2020, which provides a more long-term picture on the transformation of international production and the links in international production between trade and investment. So that will be the structure of my talk today. I'm not sure now that I can move, yes, thank you, to the next slide. So this is, I've divided up my talk into three pieces. I will first give you a quick overview of what has happened in the last 2 years with global investment, foreign direct investment, and its components, and ideas of what will happen this year and in the coming years. And then, as I mentioned, I will focus first on the short term, post-pandemic recovery, and what are governments doing to facilitate and boost investment again in the coming years. And then I will finish with a longer term perspective on the transformation of international production. And given my brief, I will try to make it as practical as possible and finish with some policy implications and concrete actions that countries can take in this difficult period around the world. Thank you. Move to the next, yes. So this is my starting picture. It is the standard picture with which we always start the World Investment Report, the trend in global foreign direct investment flows. You see here the line for the global total and for developing countries and developed countries. The main point clearly is that during 2020, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, investment flows around the world fell by 35%. And they fell below the 1 trillion mark by just 1 billion, as you see here, but still a very significant decline. You have to go back to about 2004 to find such a low level of global foreign direct investment flows. You can already discern from this picture that the decline in developing countries is much more limited than the decline in developed countries. In fact, the line here for developed countries is much more fluctuating. It has peaks and troughs that are much more pronounced. That is, of course, because FDI in developed countries includes much more financial flows rather than actual investments in new projects. So they fluctuate and they react to crises much more dramatically than the investment in developing countries. So developing countries relatively stable, but we will see that also in developing countries, the impact of COVID-19 last year was already quite pronounced. If we look at the next slide, you'll see the picture by regions around the world. So as I mentioned, the contrast between developed and developing economies is quite stark. Developed countries went down way more, and especially FDI in Europe went down by about 80%. Now, clearly that is because there is, within FDI flows in developed countries, there is conduit flows, flows through and to offshore financial centers, flows related to one-off transactions such as mergers and acquisitions. So those make the FDI flows to developed countries much more volatile. FDI in developing countries is still a very good indicator of what is really happening in international production. So what we tend to do in UNCTAD is we try to focus the picture immediately on the developing economies, because that's where FDI can really tell something about trends in international production and trends in the way that global investment flows affect global trade flows. Now you see their developing economies really went down only by about 8% in terms of FDI numbers, but you see quite big differences between the regions around the world. Asia was relatively stable. In fact, what you see there is a plus 4%, so that looks really resilient. I have to make a little warning with that, because in reality, much of that was caused by the uptick in flows to and through Hong Kong, which is counted here separately. If I would exclude that, also the numbers in Asia went down by about 4 or 5% last year. Still, that is quite a lot better than the trends in other developing and transition economies, as you can see on this slide. Looking at and zooming in a little bit on Thailand, on the region of Southeast Asia, there you see that the overall resilience in Asia was not uniform. Southeast Asia saw foreign direct investment flows decline by 25% to some 136 billion. But of course, that is after an all-time high in 2019. So in the end, compared to the global decline of 35% and the huge declines seen in other developing economies that you saw in the previous picture, the decline in Southeast Asia is ultimately not that dramatic. Also because much of it was caused by a decline in Singapore, of course, which accounts for quite a large share of FDI flows in the region. But what I put below that, greenfield and international project finance, is an interesting an interesting picture. As I mentioned, FDI doesn't give you the whole picture of what is happening in international production. In UNCTAD and in our World Investment Reports, we try to zoom in on components, on individual aspects of foreign direct investment. One of those is greenfield investment projects, and they're mostly projects, new projects in industry, manufacturing, services, and the other component we look at is international project finance, and that is more related to infrastructure investment, right? So these are two sets of investment flows. And both of those in the region of Southeast Asia went down by about 20%. Both of those are announcement-based data. So they tell you something about what's going to happen looking ahead. So the number you see here is the number for 2020. So the value of announcements in 2020 declined by about 20. And that tells you something about what we expect to happen in 2021 and 2022. Overall, still a piece of good news, right? Because the decline in Southeast Asia was less pronounced than the decline in the rest of the world, the share of the region in global FDI flows still increased. And that really is emblematic for the fact that if I look over the last more than a decade, Southeast Asia really is and has been and is still an engine of growth for global foreign direct investment. For us, it is a very interesting region. In fact, we work, for example, with the ASEAN Secretariat on the annual ASEAN Investment Report, which we are at this moment finalizing and which will be published a little bit later in the year. That report looks at the detail of foreign direct investment and greenfield and project finance trends in the region specifically, and focuses on a theme just like we do with the World Investment Report. So I advise you to look out for that report specifically. Looking at the next slide. Sorry, if you would kindly put up the next picture. Yes, this is a picture we looked at last year. It is really the transition mechanisms for the impact of COVID-19, for the impact of the pandemic on global investment trends. Now, this is a picture from last year. So the reason I put it in now is just to take a look together at, well, which of these transition mechanisms really had the biggest effect, right? And how, and to what extent were we correct in our thinking early on during the pandemic, right? So what you see here, last year, we thought, okay, the immediate impact on foreign direct investment of the pandemic is, of course, the lockdowns. The very fact that companies could not actually access construction sites to build their projects or build their new facilities. There were delays in investment approval processes because many public offices were either closed or operating at lower speed. So pure lockdown effects we calculated as the immediate impact, right? Some of that clearly happened. I believe that this has been a big impact, especially in developed countries. What we have seen in developing countries and in Asia, that countries have been relatively successful in mitigating the effects. Of course, there have been site closures, there have been factory closures, but they were resolved very quickly. Early on during the pandemic, already in the first quarter of last year, there were big declines in fixed capital formation numbers in the region, but they immediately recovered already in the second quarter. So the lockdown effects were relatively marginal. Another effect that we saw there was the effect that we expected on reinvested earnings and the capacity of international investors to reinvest the profits that they make in their existing foreign affiliates. Now, that effect has actually been much less pronounced than we expected last year. It is true, on average, if we look at corporations, international firms around the world, on average, they had a decline in profits last year of about 36%, according to financial analysts. So that is quite a big number, and we can expect that number, of course, to be, well, we assume that number is similar across foreign affiliates as well. That inevitably has an effect on the capacity of firms to reinvest those earnings in foreign affiliates. However, at the same time, we've seen that that firms have been extremely successful in maintaining liquidity and maintaining their cash reserves. So ultimately, the effect of this effect on new investment, we believe, has been relatively marginal, or at least much less than what we thought. In fact, if we look at the reinvested earnings component of FDI, it was really not much lower than in previous years. New investment restrictions, that's the third element we saw there. We immediately saw some of these early on and during the pandemic. However, they were mostly trade restrictions, mostly related to critical supply chains, but there were some investment restrictions as well, especially as a result of the fear of governments of fire sales. And the Asian region is familiar with that fear more from the 1990s. In the end, much less of this happened this time around. I will show you a picture in the next slide after this one on what is happening on investment restrictions. I will come to this in a second, if we can move back to the previous one just for one moment. So I will come to that in a moment. The effect, we believe, has been much more limited than what we thought last year. Then the fourth bar here is the recession effects. And here we really don't know what to think. I mean, of course, there has been a recession, but financial markets, as you know, have been buoyant very quickly. The actual recession numbers in many countries were very short-lived. And our colleagues at IMF have been revising upwards economic growth numbers continuously over the course of last year. So ultimately, the effect of this, we can not really estimate. What we think the effect on investment is very much one caused by the uncertainty, right? So it's not perhaps the actual economic growth numbers, but it is the uncertainty on the part of firms, on the part of multinational enterprises, international investors, on putting in new capital in productive ventures under conditions of huge uncertainty. So that's clearly the case. If we look at the projections early last year for GDP growth around the world, for trade or global exports, they were all very dramatically low in the beginning, during the first quarter and second quarter, early phase of the pandemic, but they were all much less dramatic by the end of the year. If I take, for example, global trade, early projections, if I recall correctly, from the World Trade Organization were for up to minus 33%, so 1/3 less. But ultimately, at the end of the year, global trade was only about 7% lower. So much less dramatic. However, as you've seen from my first slide, investment was actually down by 1/3 worldwide. So the investment impact has been much more dramatic. The final bar on my slide on the transmission mechanisms was about what will happen long term as a result of the move towards greater supply chain resilience. And that I will come back to in a moment when we discuss longer term trends. Now let's move on very quickly to the next slide. That's an investment policy slide. As you know, in the World Investment Report, we also have a chapter, standard chapter, monitoring investment trends around the world or investment policy trends around the world. We monitor investment policy measures. You can download all these investment policy measures and the statistics on them from our website and from the Investment Policy Hub. So UNCTAD's Investment Policy Hub. So you can look at the detail for all of this. And you can see here on this slide that, in fact, we did measure last year a record number of restrictive and regulatory policies related to foreign direct investment. However, as you see there, I put a sticker on this chart. In the Southeast Asian region, that's really not the case. If you look at our data, the investment policy measures taken in the Southeast Asian region have almost all, without exception, been in the direction of more promotion, more facilitation of foreign direct investment. So this is really an exceptional case. Of course, the signing also last year of the RCEP agreement is a point in case, and there's really an attempt to maintain and build on open trade and investment policy environments, so supporting investors. We actually published on the very day that the RCEP agreement was signed a special issue of our Global Investment Trends Monitor, focusing specifically on RCEP. So I will not talk too much about this in my presentation today, and I would invite you to download that and look at it separately at what we expect for in FDI trends and FDI policy trends in the RCEP as a result of the RCEP signing. Next, please. So I mentioned earlier, we do look a little bit more in detail below FDI at the different components or different types of, I should say, types of foreign direct investment. So I already mentioned greenfield. I mentioned international project finance. So greenfield is industry, international project finance is mostly infrastructure, and cross-border M&As are, of course, the third component here that we look at in our data. Cross-border M&As are much less interesting from the perspective of developing countries. A, because they are relatively small in developing countries. B, because they are a little bit less helpful from the perspective of building new productive capacity. So we tend to focus on greenfield and project finance. As you see here, greenfield projects in industry have been much worse hit than international project finance and infrastructure. That is partly because companies, multinational enterprises investing in greenfield are more reactive than the long-term planning needed for infrastructure projects. But it's good to keep in mind, greenfield investment in industry has been worse affected. I will talk about this a little bit more. But more than that, you see here already the first quarter of 2021, and it is still down, right? So it is still negative and still not showing signs of recovery. Now, of course, the current situation in Southeast Asia, which I understand is in some countries in the region, perhaps even more severe than last year, and with more severe lockdowns. So this is a risk that we're running in the region specifically, that greenfield projects in industry, in manufacturing, might be affected by this again this year. Next, please. This is just a quick picture here because, of course, we are the UN. So we look at investment trends not just from the perspective of international production or from the perspective of global value chain and trade, but we also look at investment in sectors that are relevant for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We actually publish a dedicated SDG investment trends monitor. And so I've picked a few numbers from that. What you see here in 2020, the numbers for the key sectors that are relevant for Sustainable Development Goals, infrastructure, renewable energy, water and sanitation, health, food and agriculture, education, they have been hit quite severely during the pandemic. And these are value numbers. Project numbers are slightly less affected. Renewable energy is the most resilient sector. Actually, in terms of project numbers, renewable energy went up, but all the others have been quite severely affected. And already the SDGs were adopted in 2015. We have shown over the years that the investment needs associated with the Sustainable Development Goals, which we first calculated in our 2014 World Investment Report, those investment needs were already not met by the growth in international investment. But what little progress there was made over the past 5 years was in a large part undone last year. So we really need, and this is of course policy advice that we provide more at the level of UN and in discussions in the UN General Assembly, but we really need to boost again the push for investment in SDG relevant sectors. Next, please. Okay, and that's my final picture talking about trends, and then we'll move on. And that is just a forward-looking picture. Now, these are our projections for FDI. We project FDI for each year in which we publish the World Investment Report. This is for 2021. Last year, we thought 2021 would still be negative, and that is because investment generally reacts to economic trends with a bit of a delay. So we thought that also the recovery would also face a delay, but with all the upward revisions in economic data, in trade data, now our latest projections show a marginal increase also in 2021 and a partial recovery in 2022 with almost full recovery at the top end of the expectations there. Looking at Southeast Asia, again, the uncertainty factor is huge, and we are projecting for Asia about 5 to 10% growth in 2021. But with the latest developments in the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic in Southeast Asia, we might be safer at the bottom end of those projections for 2021. Let's move on to the next part of my discussion here. Next slide, please. Yes, yeah, next slide, please. We're now moving to talking about recovery and policies aimed at pushing investment for post-pandemic recovery. And when we thought about what to advise governments and what to advise countries on promoting on investment priorities for post-pandemic recovery, we thought about, well, especially in developing countries, let's look at what we really need to start again the growth in productive capacity. This is an old theme of UNCTAD, an old theme of ITD, of course, building productive capacity for trade, building productive capacity for economic growth. Now, UNCTAD came up with this structure for key components of productive capacity, and they are about building ICT and ICT infrastructure, building energy generation or power generation and energy supply, promoting private sector development, building transportation infrastructure and connectivity, promoting structural change, right? So from agricultural societies to basic manufacturing to higher value-added manufacturing to services and knowledge industries, improving human capital and exploiting in the best way possible what natural capital might exist in countries. So this is the method by which UNCTAD tries to analyze the promotion of productive capacities in developing countries. And this picture just provides you with a different lens for looking at investment data. right? So we saw different lenses already. I've provided you with the lens simply looking at greenfield and project finance. I've provided you briefly with a lens for investment looking at SDG sectors. And this is a lens looking at the components or investment in, international investment in the components of productive capacity. And you see that some of the productive capacity sectors have been quite severely hit during the pandemic, with the exception of ICT. Of course, digital industries, e-commerce, ICT has, it was already a growth industry, but of course, as a result of the pandemic, with the increased use of remote working, of remote shopping, e-commerce, that sector has really moved up the ladder. All other sectors have been quite severely hit. So in thinking about, okay, if we need to promote investment for recovery, this is a useful lens. It just shows you where do we need to push both domestic and international investment. Next slide, please. So what we did in the World Investment Report this year is we looked at what governments are already doing. And there is a lot of money being poured in by the public sector, by governments in supporting businesses, supporting households, first of all, but supporting businesses through the pandemic. Of course, most of that recovery support is spent in and by developed economies, rich economies that have more availability of funds. But there is a significant amount, you see almost 2 trillion there, also being spent by developing economies. The latest data we got from the IMF's monitor of public outlays towards post-pandemic recovery shows around 240 billion of recovery funds having been announced in the Southeast Asian region, just by way of comparison. So a lot of that is being spent is being spent right now and is planned to be spent in the next 2 to 3 years. Most packages are planned to be spent in about 2 to 3 years. You see that I divided it up there between income support, which is just being spent immediately to support businesses and households. Investment retention, that is really about trying to keep businesses afloat. It's about guarantees for businesses to keep on operating. And some of it, a relatively small part at the moment, is new investment generation. So these are both in terms investment guarantees for private companies for new projects, but most of it is, of course, dedicated to infrastructure and new infrastructure projects. So at the moment, still a relatively small component of the recovery packages being adopted by countries, but already with quite a big effect. Let me just make one more comment on this. Of course, you see there by far the biggest amount is in developed countries, but because there will be spillover effects, simply the enormous amounts of money being spent in developed countries, even looking at the investment packages, that will have cross-border spillover effects also at developed countries. We go into those in quite a little bit of detail in the World Investment Report. So these numbers are very relevant also for this region. Looking at the next slide for a second, it shows you, it looks only at the long-term investment support in infrastructure of the recovery packages laid out by governments around the world. And it just shows you the enormous size of this and the potential effect this might have on cross-border investment. This is data from the G20's Global Infrastructure Investment Hub. And it shows you the growth of infrastructure investment around the world over the past 10 years or so. And it shows you the implied investment push that is implied by the packages being spent that you saw on the previous slide, right? And what you can see here is the enormous increase implied by the current packages, right? So while growth has been on average around 2% per year, with a peak period of growth, of annual growth of about 7%, the implied growth over the coming three years or so is 24% per year, right? So that's more than 3 times the highest level of growth that we have seen over the past 10 years. And this picture is just there to show you the enormous challenges that we expect to see in the absorptive capacity of countries, the actual implementation capacity of countries, and the pressure it will put on infrastructure companies around the world, right? So clearly, one of the spillover effects that I was referring to when I spoke about the previous slide is the fact that if the amounts in developed countries are so huge, they're going to require a lot of productive assets of construction companies around the world, and they will pull in those capacities, not just from their own economies, but from all over, which might lead to upward price pressure on infrastructure build-up around the world. So that's one of the spillover effects that we could see of those enormous numbers we've seen in rich countries around the world. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a very busy slide. There's lots of words on it. I will just be a little bit selective in taking you through this and just conclude this discussion on post-pandemic investment promotion priorities. This is the policy framework we present in the World Investment Report. The strategic approach and industrial policy approach that we recommend to countries is to focus on not just supply chain, but overall economic resilience, to balance the promotion of industry and infrastructure investment. We think, as I showed you earlier, that greenfield investment in industry has been much harder hit than infrastructure investment. Most of the recovery packages focus very much on infrastructure investment. But as you saw on the slide with the policy priorities related to productive capacity, it makes a lot of sense to also promote as complementary measures greenfield investment in industry, because much of that productive capacity comes from that. So in short, the investment recovery packages of governments are very much focused on infrastructure. That is the right focus. It is also a logical focus, because that is where governments have that's the lever that governments have, and they can more easily invest in infrastructure than they can invest in industry. But for promoting productive capacity growth and for promoting and kickstarting economic growth again in the post-pandemic world, it is very important to have parallel measures to promote investment in industry. So that's the balance that we discussed there. The remainder of this long list here of recommendations focuses on some of the challenges that we see arising with the big recovery packages around the world. I would move on, otherwise my discussion becomes too long, and I would invite you to look at those in the report itself. And I will move to the next section, where we talk more about the trade policy and investment policy links as a result of the expected longer-term transformation of international production. Please move ahead. Next slide, please. As I said, the longer-term picture. So this gives you a very long view of what happened with foreign direct investment in the last 3 decades, just by way of introduction of my long-term perspective. What you can see here is that international production really has seen very rapid growth in the 1990s, already slower growth, but still very quick in the 2000s, but really almost stagnation in the 2010s. I mentioned earlier that the Southeast Asian region has almost been the exception to this rule, in the sense that during the 2010s, during the last decade, Southeast Asia was almost the only region that was still pulling the growth path for global foreign direct investment. So in the region, FDI and trade has still grown throughout the decade. But if you look at the global picture, worldwide, that growth really stagnated in the 2010s. Now so the pandemic really came on top of what was already a stagnating picture in international production. And when I say international production, I mean, of course, the combination of trade and investment in global value chains, in global networks of multinational enterprises. Let's look at the next slide. As I said, the pandemic really arrived on top of an already existing situation of slowdown of international production, and it arrived on top of some existing, what we call mega trends in international production. And those mega trends here are just summarized in three areas, right? So one is clearly technology and the new industrial revolution, or Industry 4.0 is another name for it. So this includes advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, digitalization of the supply chain, 3D printing, etc., and the huge effect it will have on global supply chains. The second area is, of course, policy and economic governance, and of course the fact that in the last decade, the global policy environment for international trade and for international investment was much less favorable than it was before. There's been a return of protectionist pressures, a return of interventionism, and rather than multilateral, much more regional and bilateral and ad hoc economic cooperation. And the final trend here is everything related to the sustainability imperative, right? So new policies and regulations to promote sustainability. Of course, pressures driven by the market and by consumers for products and processes that are more sustainable. And all of that has significant implications for supply chains. And of course, we've seen already some physical supply chain impacts even before the COVID pandemic. The pandemic was not the first time that there have been adverse impacts on global supply chains. Some of them have already been caused by adverse weather effects or floods. And you are all familiar with this, especially in this region and country. Next slide, please. So as a result of these megatrends, combined with the COVID-19 pandemic, we analyzed last year some likely trajectories that we see international production will take over the coming decade, right? So a longer term perspective. And this is very much a firm level perspective. So it is what we expect multinational enterprises and international investors to do over the coming decade, right? And you see here reshoring, diversification, regionalization, and the last one, replication. These are firm perspectives. Reshoring, you see there this word that was also in the title of my talk today. So what are some of these trajectories? What do they imply, right? So reshoring is, of course, much talked about as a result of policy pressures, as a result of the trade tensions happening around the world, but specifically or particularly between China and the United States. And what it has been expected to lead to is, well, a restructuring of international production networks, even divestment has been talked about, moving back of foreign affiliates and international production facilities back to home countries, right? It has been expected to lead to a shrinking of efficiency-seeking foreign direct investment, in especially manufacturing, but also some services looking for low-cost labor. Of course, that's what we mean with efficiency-seeking foreign direct investment. This is one of the trends we analyzed. Ultimately, we look at it again in this year's World Investment Report, and we look at new analysis here. Ultimately, we expect this effect to be much less dramatic than often commented on in the media, right? Simply the cost of restructuring international production network is absolutely huge. The sunk costs involved are very big, so that it's not a decision that companies will take lightly. Given that, especially the options that companies have to just shift production around in existing networks and existing facilities, or to create supply chain resilience through supply chain risk management tools that would make it less necessary to reshore, these will prevail. So reshoring, we do not expect it to be such a dramatic effect, but it is still, for the longer term, an important trajectory to keep in mind. It will impact on longer term investment decisions. Diversification, another one, which is just as a result of policy tensions, as a result of the push for supply chain resilience, companies will be looking to diversify production capacities, place it in more than one location. That will actually lead to some countries having new opportunities to participate in global value chains, right? However, because managing diversified supply chains and diversified international production networks is much more complex for companies, we think that the degree of digitalization and the use of platforms in such a strategy for firms will be much higher, right? So it may be more difficult so on the one hand, there is greater opportunities for developing countries to participate. On the other hand, it is also slightly more difficult and requires technological capabilities to do so. Regionalization is probably one of the more important trajectories that we see at the moment. It is also, there was already a very clear idea that when you look at trade in global value chains, these global value chains should really be called regional value chains, right? So trade has always been relatively more regional than global in nature. And this is a known fact, and it's been analyzed many times, including as a result of value-added and trade data, which was developed in the first part of the 2010. So this is clear. However, for investment, this picture was much less clear until recently, right? We developed some new data in the last few years that you can download from the UNCTAD website, which is on ultimate ownership data. And ultimate ownership data simply means who owns, or investors from what home country actually own the foreign affiliates in third countries, right? So it shows you the investment links in much greater detail. And investment links, as it turns out, are much more global in nature than they are regional in nature, right? So if I look, for example, at the Southeast Asian region, the headline figure for intra-regional FDI, so FDI flows taking place within the region, The headline figure is about 17%, right? 17% of FDI stock in the region being coming from other countries within the region. But if I look at ultimate ownership data, then you see that actually much of that investment is ultimately still owned by investors in Europe or the United States or Japan. So the investment picture is still a lot less regional than the trade picture. And that, as a result of the trends and the transformation of international production, we believe might change, and there's greater scope for actual regional investment flows. The last one I will skip it. We're really talking about distributed manufacturing as a result of 3D printing. This is, of course, clearly an important trend. In fact, the ASEAN investment report this year, which will look very in great detail at Industry 4.0, we'll talk about this much more and much more in relation to the actual region. So hold out for that report later this year. Next slide, please. Of course, the picture I showed you on my previous slide was very much a generalization. Of course, you need to look at individual industries and that industry-specific trends. None of the trajectories that I showed are mutually exclusive. They will take place in parallel, even within the same industry, as you see on this slide. Reshoring, diversification, regionalization will to some degree take place even within the same industries and same sectors, because they are firm level choices. So it's multinational enterprises who decide to go in a certain direction. And even within multinational enterprises, they may pick up elements of the different trajectories. Next slide, please. Okay, the transformation of international production will, of course, bring both challenges and opportunities for policymakers, right? So very quickly going through this. So on the challenges side, the actual transformation will have restructuring implications, so longer-term restructuring implications. At the same time, that restructuring will provide opportunities for some countries to attract new investments or new investors looking to diversify their supply bases, right? The next challenge looking at, no, sorry, please go back. I was still listing the challenges and opportunities. So we do see a shrinking pool of efficiency-seeking investment. The picture I showed earlier of the big decline in greenfield investment in industry was just emblematic. We have seen much structurally lower investment, efficiency-seeking investment in manufacturing in the second half of the last decade already. So efficiency-seeking investment was already shrinking. The pandemic has further showed a further decline. However, we do see on the opportunity side increasing opportunities to attract market-seeking FDI, right? Another challenge is that value capture in global value chains might become more difficult for developing countries. And what do we mean with that? It is the objective, structural transformation objective of developing countries has traditionally been to increase value added in captured within international production network. And because the technological requirements to do so will probably increase, I mentioned that under the heading of diversification, that will lead to some difficulties or increased difficulties for lower income countries. At the same time, value chains are expected to become shorter, and there will be opportunities to capture more investment in final goods production, right? And finally, the world of GVCs that has driven investment development policy guidance for, well, more than a decade or 2 decades, and that has led to the buildup of certain types of infrastructure to facilitate such global value chains, such as the enormous amount of free zones or special economic zones for big industry that have been developed over the decades. And that now requires, but that that type of infrastructure risks seeing some diminishing returns with the restructuring of international production, but there are returns on investment in digital infrastructure and platforms. And as you saw already in my earlier picture, it's the only area where investment at the moment or during the pandemic has continued to grow. Now, I promised, and I'm at my last few minutes of my talk, so I promised to conclude with some practical implications. So let me move to that very quickly. Well, next slide, please. So the practical implications for countries that I was asked to conclude on here presented at the strategic level. So the transformation of international production and the investment development path for governments to keep in mind. Well, you see here, and it is basically building on what I just said in my previous slide, it's a from to slide. So we go from export-oriented development strategies to what we have called export plus plus. So no longer focusing exclusively or primarily on trying to attract investment in or efficiency-seeking investment, but also try to attract investment to produce for local markets and try to attract investment in infrastructure. From promoting efficiency-seeking investment to market-seeking investment. From targeting GVC segments and tasks that has been a mainstay of development strategy for the last 15 years. And so the opportunity for developing countries to attract pieces of global value chains. That now, with the longer term expected transformation of international production, will shift towards policy advice to build more integrated industrial clusters. Cost-based competition for single location investors. What do we mean with that? Well, it had the type of zero-sum investment promotion, right? We need to have the lowest cost location because each individual investor will only want one location with the lowest cost. That will now shift towards more competition for diversified investments. So an investor may be looking for multiple locations. It is no longer just zero-sum. And not just cost, but also flexibility and resilience will be key selling points for locations. Prioritizing large-scale investors, well, industrial investors. Well, clearly, the priority for investment promotion agencies around the world has always been, let's get the biggest ones, let's get the biggest clients, the biggest manufacturing sites. But with the expected transformation of international production, it is important to look at opportunities to attract smaller scale manufacturing, and therefore it is important to offer such smaller scale facilities and services to attract it. And that implies not just offering big infrastructure to attract investment, but also lean infrastructure, right? So that's the strategic level of policy advice. And then concluding slide, and that concludes my talk. Next slide, please. Some concrete implications for investment promotion agencies and special economic zones around the world, but especially in the region, of course. So what can you do, or what should you be doing? Well, assess what are the likely trajectories of, for international production trajectories that I presented for the industries and activities that you have in your existing FDI profile. So you have your existing investors focused on certain industries. What do you expect the trajectories to be that they will follow? Based on that, what are then the retention options for economic activities that could be at risk of reshoring or relocation, right? Assess then the opportunities to promote your location for as a nearshoring or regional supply chain flexibility and resilience basis, right? Then review your approach to targeting investors based on the previous points, right? So what are the benefits that you should be offering to your investors based on the availability of broader industrial clusters and market-seeking opportunities, right? Promote regional investment and consider opportunities to engage or enhance cooperation with IPAs in the region, right? consider diversifying the offerings of special economic zones, right? Not just large-scale export-oriented industrial investment, but a range of locations extending down to facilities for small-scale manufacturing, including what is so-called maker spaces, so the type of incubators for smaller-scale manufacturing and supply capacity. And finally, not just promoting efficiency-seeking FDI, but also enhance capabilities to promote investment in infrastructure and domestic services, right? So these are the types of concrete policy advice that we give to investment promotion agencies in developing countries and to special economic zones in developing countries. I can tell you that especially the first 3 points here, these strategic assessments, many IPAs are already making them or are in the process of developing these type of strategic assessments. And I would urge all participants in that business to make sure you do not fall behind. So with that, I conclude my talk. I hope I have stayed within my allotted time. And I'm afraid there is not much time left for questions and answers, but I am very happy to answer questions should there be any. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present our work to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Rashad. But actually, there are some minutes left for you to answer the question. But first of all, according to your information, I found it's very interesting. And I am sure that all the policymakers will look closer and try to make a decision how to rejuvenate all the global economy and trade after this. And here, since we only have like 5 minutes, Mr. Rashad, so I'll pick just one question from the participants to ask you. Okay, let's see. From your point of view, Mr. Bovin, what are the significant benefits or challenges of FDI measures that would impact on investment policy in the Asia-Pacific region in post-COVID-19?
The specific measures that will impact on FDI in the post-COVID world in the region. I think what we are seeing is a real desire on the part of countries in Southeast Asia to promote and facilitate investment. And so hardly any, if any at all, of the policy measures taken, national policy measures taken in countries in the region are in the direction of regulation or restriction of investment. That is clearly showing the importance that countries attach to attracting foreign direct investment for economic growth and development. The measures that will be very important are the type of investment facilitation measures that make it easier for investors to access information on the regulatory environment, on administrative processes, that make it easier for investors to find locations, to gain permits, access land, etc. So typical investment facilitation measures are very important. And we see a lot of those being taken, and a lot of those we also support by implementing in UNCTAD's investment division what we call investment facilitation platforms. We call them e-regulations and e-registration. So we support countries in doing this. I'm convinced that these measures are an important part of the package. Other measures that will be important, if I look specifically at international policy measures in the region, there are an enormous number of international investment agreements. Most countries in the region maintain quite a large network of international investment agreements. Some countries are more reticent or are pulling back. But then, of course, the new agreement, the RCEP agreement, overlaps or becomes an umbrella of many of these investment agreements already. Now, the RCEP agreement, for example, does have investment components, but I think it is important to realize that almost more than that investment component of the agreement, it is the trade and intellectual property and e-commerce type of rules in those agreements that will have a bigger effect almost on investment than the actual investment components of the agreement. So I think it is very important to realize that investment policy measures at the international level do not stand alone. They live within a policy environment where trade, intellectual property, data flow, and e-commerce measures are almost more important.
Okay.
So I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah, quite enough. But if to focus on Thailand, has our government facilitated enough to draw foreign investment to come to Thailand after this?
Your question is, have they done enough? And of course, it is never enough. But I think that the investment policy environment in Thailand is still quite attractive. There's been a decline last year, but I'm convinced that both at the national level and within the ASEAN region, Thailand is still has still potential to attract further investment.
Thank you for being kind and answer that question. Thank you so much, Mr. Richard Bovin. It's nice to have you here. A pleasure. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
And this is the first session, so we are going to take a mini break for 5 minutes. So all the participants, you can go to get some water or might go to restroom. And then after 5 minutes, we come back to our virtual seminar again. So stay tuned, don't go anywhere.
On the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the International Institute for Trade and Development, or ITD, I wish to congratulate all of you for having contributed to its continued existence.
บริษัทปตท.สำรวจและผลิตปิโตรเลียมจำกัดมหาชนหรือปตท.สผ.บริษัทคนไทยที่มุ่งมั่นสำรวจและผลิตพลังงานจากแหล่งก๊าซธรรมชาติและน้ำมันดิบมากกว่า3 ทศวรรษภายใต้แนวคิดองค์กรแห่งความยั่งยืนเราสำรวจความมุ่งมั่นผลิตความเชี่ยวชาญเราสำรวจโอกาสผลิตธุรกิจที่ถูกต้องโปร่งใสเราสำรวจความสุขผลิตคุณภาพชีวิตทั้งหมดนี้เพื่อสานประโยชน์ร่วมกับผู้มีส่วนได้ส่วนเสียทุกฝ่ายภายใต้วิสัยทัศน์ Energy Partner of Choice เพราะความมั่นคงด้านพลังงานคือจุดเริ่มต้นในการขับเคลื่อนของทุกชีวิตเราจะก้าวต่อไปด้วยกันเพื่อพลังงานที่ยั่งยืนปตท.สผ. Energy Partner of Choice
The oceans are vital to our future. Food from oceans accounts for a significant percentage of the protein consumed by the world's growing population. And just as the oceans are fundamental to our survival, the seafood industry is fundamental to the survival of the oceans. At Thai Union, we look at the seafood industry and we see great opportunity and great responsibility. We believe we must proactively care for our resources today in order to feed our children and their children tomorrow. This belief fuels our passion for building an integrated, transparent organization based on quality control, sustainability, and ethical practice. This belief supports our investment in research and innovation, constantly learning and growing, deepening and broadening our seafood expertise. Becoming an agent of change to make a positive difference throughout our supply and value chains around the globe. This is why we have built a strong partnership with business, as well as supported strong consumer brands. So that we can work with customers to optimize their needs, while still delighting consumers with new tastes and healthy product. As we continue to grow and integrate the seafood industry for the benefit of our stakeholders and the future of our planet, Thai Union will always stand for trust, leadership, and seafood expertise.
Hello again, welcome back everyone, every beloved audience. Let's begin again with the virtual seminar, Recharging Asia. Let's talk about global investment. So we will moving on to the commission papers presented by many experts and professors who had experiences related to the trade and investment issues. Please let's take a closer look at international investment agreements or IIAs reforms in Thailand. And here we are honored to have the head of International Agreement Subdivision at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Kraichak Thirathayakhinan.
Hello everyone. สวัสดีครับ My name is Dr. Kraichak Thirathayakhinan. I'm here today to present my paper to you via video clip. That's how COVID-19 has changed my world and yours. First of all, I have two apologies to make. The first, I want to apologize for the COVID-19 hairstyle that I have. My hair is getting very long, and like many of you, I have been working from home for the past 2 months, and I never had a chance to have my hair cut. The second apology is on the quality of this video and how smooth or the lack thereof it would be. I am somebody that you may call a technology challenged person. In fact, I actually asked my wife to help me with the making of this video, and luckily she said yes, although reluctantly. Before we start, I have a few words to give to the organizer of this event, the ITD, International Trade and Development. I would like to thank the ITD for organizing this event. Given the COVID-19 situation in Thailand, they have made an enormous effort to make this happen, and the title of Recharging Asia, Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Development Amidst Post-Pandemic World is timely. As we are in the middle of the third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic here in Thailand, this is a good opportunity to think ahead and discuss what we can do better in the post-COVID world. The title of the regional forum is Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Development in the Post-Pandemic World. And the area of interest, the topic of my paper is on International Investment Agreements, or IIAs. Let me explain a little bit more. Traditionally, IIAs are used to protect investors, usually from developed countries who invest in developing countries. As a response, many developing countries use IIAs to attract foreign direct investments. And over the years, as IIAs proliferate, there is an increase in investor-state dispute settlement (ISDS) cases. Recently, more developed country governments are at the receiving end of ISDS litigation, which may trigger a shift in opinions about IIAs. Countries have started to seriously discuss about IIA reform, which has gathered momentum in recent years. According to UNCTAD, since 2008, there has been IIA reorientation towards a more balanced investment protection regime. UNCTAD has advocated IIA reform for almost a decade now, since 2012, particularly in relation to sustainable development. The IIA reorientation means that countries start to move away from unqualified investment protection on part of foreign investors to more regulatory space on part of the government. The right to regulate has become more and more important. COVID-19 pandemic may have accelerated the pace of and the need for IIA reform even further, as governments around the world need to impose measures to combat outbreaks and spread of the virus. For example, travel bans, closure of business premises, and financial assistance for companies adversely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. These governments might be at risk of violating IIA obligations, and in turn, they could be sued through ISDS provisions. So the topic of my paper is Thailand's IIA moving towards a more balanced investment protection regime. As IIAs are one of my areas of interest, when I was asked to write a paper that would fit under the title of Recharging Asia, Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Development Amidst Post-Pandemic World, I thought it would be interesting to look at how Thailand was handling IIA reform and whether it was moving towards a more balanced investment protection regime or not. What do I mean by a more balanced investment protection regime? The balance is between investment protection on part of foreign investors and regulatory space on part of the government. Just to explain a little bit more, how this linked to the title of the Trade and Development Regional Forum 2021. Regulatory space is what the government needs to pursue legitimate public welfare objectives, including sustainable development and containment of the COVID-19 pandemic. If governments are afraid to implement measures to achieve these objectives because they do not want to risk violating IIA obligations and being sued by foreign investors through ISDS, they may not actively pursue these objectives that are good for the public, that are good for you and me. This is not to say that investors should not be protected under IIAs. The point I'm trying to make is that there must be a balance. So a little bit about this paper then. The paper aims to determine whether Thailand has moved towards a more balanced investment protection regime with regard to IIAs. How does the paper do it? The paper will conduct a preliminary review of the investment chapter into IIAs related to Thailand. The first is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership RCEP agreement, and the second is Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership CPTPP. Let me tell you a little bit more about these two agreements. The first, the RCEP agreement, is the most recent IIA that Thailand has concluded. It has 15 parties, namely the ASEAN 10, Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. The CPTPP, on the other hand, is an IIA that Thailand has expressed its interest in joining. Thailand actually did express the interest since the agreement was originally called TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, when the US was part of the membership. But now the CPTPP has 11 parties, namely Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. And if you look at the two agreements, you see that there are 7 countries that are parties to both agreements, namely Australia, Brunei, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Vietnam. Next, I want to show you the structure of this paper. There are 3 sections. The first is on stock-taking of IIA reform efforts in recent years. The second is on preliminary review of investment chapter in the RCEP agreement and the CPTPP. And the third section is on lessons learned and charging forward. So let's dive in more detail on each of these sections. The first section, stock-taking of IIA reforms efforts in recent years. This section will look at IIA reform efforts taken by countries and international organizations like UNCTAD and the Working Group 3 of the Aussie Trial. For example, the 3 phases of reform advocated by UNCTAD and the work on ISDS reform by the Working Group 3 of the Aussie Trial. Overall, it can be seen that more emphasis is placed on regulatory space and legitimate public welfare objectives. Governments must strike a balance between investment protection on the one hand and the right to regulate on the other hand when they negotiate an IIA. Due to limitation of this paper, I am not trying to materially contribute to the debate on IIA reform. However, I will use the works done by UNCTAD, the Working Group 3 of the Aussie Trial, and to a limited extent, European Commission on International Investment Court, and use these works as the basis for preliminary review of the investment chapter in the RCEP agreement and in the CPTPP. In the second section, preliminary review of investment chapter in the RCEP agreement and in the CPTPP. This section will be divided obviously into 2 subsections, one on the RCEP agreement chapter 10 and the other on the CPTPP chapter 9. Each subsection will look at definitions of investment and covered investment, substantive provisions on national treatment, most favored nation treatment, fair and equitable treatment, full protection and security, indirect expropriation, and general exceptions, as well as provisions on investor-state dispute settlement. The section will assess whether the investment chapters in the RCEP agreement and the CPTPP provide increased regulatory space on part of the government or not. In other words, do they moving away from unqualified protection on parts of foreign investors and give more policy space for the government to pursue legitimate public welfare objectives. And the last section, lesson learned and charting forward, this section will conclude the findings from the earlier sections, and it will discuss in more detail on Thailand's recent IIA reform efforts, notably the establishment of the Committee on the Protection of International Investments in 2019 and the reformulation of Thailand's model treaty for IIAs in 2020. This section will also touch briefly on the challenges that remain, particularly how Thailand will deal with the existing IIAs, namely 36 bilateral investment treaties or BITs and 9 free trade agreements or FTAs with an investment chapter. So that is the introduction of my short paper that I'm writing for the ITD. I hope that it will provide some insights on Thailand's current investment protection regime and how it might evolve in the future. Lastly, all the views and opinions in this paper is mine and mine alone. They are simply derived from my research on the topic and 10 years of working on the issue. So thank you very much for your kind attention. Stay safe, stay sane, and I hope that next time we meet, it will be in person. Thank you very much. สวัสดีครับ
Thanks to you as well, Dr. Krajak, for your very kind attention and for declaring the conclusive explanations of the International Investment Agreement. Moving on to the commission papers, we still have some case study about how COVID-19 has disrupted supply chains in Asia-Pacific region. And we will be hearing this section from the Assistant Professor from the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi, Dr. Adil Nakoda. Please welcome.
Hello, I'm Dr. Adil Nakoda, Assistant Professor at the Institute of Business Administration, Karachi. I'd like to thank International Institute for Trade and Development to provide an opportunity to present and publish my paper at the Trade and Development Regional Forum 2021. The title of my paper is COVID-19 and Disruption in Supply Chains, Case Study of Asia-Pacific Region. First, I will start with the introduction of my study. Several countries in the Asia-Pacific region, often referred to as the factory of the world, undertook measures to curtail the spread of the pandemic. As a result, the lack of global trading activity had rippling effects on production and trade flows. Some countries undertook a more stringent response than others, reporting a higher level of workplace closures. These closures disrupted the global supply chains and the flow of goods across borders. The closures not only dampen their own trade flows, but also have an adverse impact on regional and global commerce and trade. The Linear Shipping Connectivity Index measures the maritime connectivity of countries, as some countries are more connected than others. Countries with better connectivity often form an integral part of the global value chains. Hence, higher connectivity index coupled with greater stringency in workplace closure can create large disruptions to global value chains. Now I will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on trade. So, COVID-19 pandemic resulted in several disruptions to global value chains. This has been discussed in recent literature. Countries adopted different trade interventions to curtail the adverse economic impact within their borders. Trade interventions included various measures such as export restrictions and import liberalization in order to ensure domestic demand is met, particularly of critical goods. Several economies have undertaken RTAs with trade partners to boost trade over the years. RTAs often include provisions to not only reduce the cost of trade, but also to improve facilitation between member countries through better coordination. The non-tariff measures can play an important role to harmonize standards and ensure consumer confidence during a pandemic. Further, it is important to note that countries that remain relatively open in terms of workplace closures may capture export market shares from countries that reported more stringent closures. The export value of products is calculated in which Asia-Pacific countries included in the sample have a greater than fair share in exports, or RCA greater than or equal to 1. And countries that have adopted less stringent closures are more competitive in terms of their unit value of exports against countries that have adopted more stringent measures. So data on workplace closures is borrowed from Oxford Coronavirus Government Response Tracker for year 2020. Data on UNCTAD's Linear Shipping Connectivity Index is borrowed from World Bank's World Development Indicators for year 2019. Data on trade flows is borrowed from CEPII's PSEI dataset and United Nations Comtrade dataset. The latest year available for BACI dataset is 2019, while that for Comtrade is 2020. Data on participation levels in global value chains is borrowed from United Nations ESCAP, and data on product groups classified according to global value chains is borrowed from World Bank's World Integrated Trade Solution. Data on trade interventions in 2020 is extracted from Global Trade Alert. Data on non-tariff measures is extracted from UNCTAD's NTM Hub, and data on RTAs is extracted from WTO's RTA database. The two-pronged strategy is adopted to define the participation in global value chains. One uses the United Nations ESCAP Regional Integration and Value Chain Analyzer, RIVA, and the other uses the product categories defined according to the reference data available at WITS. The RIVA classifies participation in global value chains in the following way. So domestic production in the first exporter that returns via importers' exports back to the exporting country. Domestic production used in importers' exports to a third country. Double-counted exports due to repeated border crossings. Foreign production consumed by the importer or the value added in the exporting country from the use of foreign inputs in production of exports to the importing country. This study does not account for the value of domestic production in terms of final and intermediate goods consumed by the importer, as it only considers value addition in trade that involve multiple border crossings. WITS product classification for global value chains includes intermediate and final goods of apparel, footwear and textile products, vehicles and electronics. This is the list of countries according to the respective statuses. The countries are split at the median level of each indicator. Countries reporting high report index values equal to or greater than the median calculated for each indicator. Now let me mention some of the literature on the topic. So Baldwin and Tomuria, 2020, Javorcik and Miridot, 2020, discussed the vulnerabilities of global value chains to the pandemic, highlighting the impact on trade. Oitman, Fiorini, and Yildirim, 2020, and Evnet et al., 2021, discuss the trade-related government interventions to alleviate COVID-19 shocks. Certain trade interventions can hurt global trade. Bhatia, 2020, highlights the key areas in the WTO and capacities to address market failures. Ahmad et al., 2021, conduct a survey of Pakistani firms to gauge the impact of COVID-19 on business activities. The analysis and results will be presented in the following sequence. The discussions will involve: 1, evaluating the impact of COVID-19 on global supply chains or value chains. 2, determine the trade patterns associated with the product classifications as discussed above. Number 3, analyze the most frequently used trade interventions on exports and imports in 2020 in response to the pandemic. Number 4, consider the role of RTAs and NTMs in trade from the region. And number 5, evaluate the opportunities for countries with lower levels of workplace closure in participation in global value chains. When evaluating the impact of COVID-19 on global value chains, I studied the total value of trade, both exports and imports, which flows into Asia-Pacific countries distributed by the statuses based on the level of workplace closure and LSCI. I expect that countries with higher levels of LSCI to trade more than their less connected counterparts. I present the growth rate of exports and imports between 2019 and 2020. I expect that countries reporting a higher level of workplace closure are likely to experience a fall in the demand of goods, resulting in fall in imports, while countries with lower levels of workplace closure are likely to experience a fall in the demand of their goods, resulting in fall in exports. Here we can see that countries with higher levels of LSCI were trading more than the countries with lower levels of LSCI. Although the fall in exports is more obvious according to the level of closure than the fall in imports, it can be said that countries with lower levels of closure are experiencing a larger decline in exports, while countries with higher levels of closure are experiencing more of a decline in imports. So imports and exports of product categories are classified as defined in World Bank's WITS. Countries with higher levels of LSCI are more likely to participate in global value chains, while trade of electronics is likely to dominate the flow in the Asia-Pacific region. Indicators on composition of global value chains are extracted from Asian Development Bank's multi-region input-output tables using WWZ composition with the aid of classifications provided by United Nations ESCAP's REVA. So countries with higher levels of LSCI are more likely to facilitate global value chains involving multiple border crossings of goods. The global value chains within Asia-Pacific countries are likely to be the most prominent, with regional countries extracting the largest value addition. Lastly, value addition in electrical equipment is most likely to be driven by foreign inputs, signifying the dependence on global value chains. While countries reporting higher levels of LSCI are most likely to participate in global value chains, the trade of electronic goods, both in terms of final and intermediate goods, is likely to be the most prominent. Foreign production consumed by the importer has an important contribution in terms of value addition based on the components of global value chains. The Asia-Pacific countries are more likely to report a higher value of participation in global value chains in dollar terms, which shows the importance of supply chain linkages within the region. The exports of electrical equipment are more likely to consist of inputs from foreign origins across majority of the four statuses. Governments undertook various interventions in order to not only meet the surge in domestic demand of goods as the pandemic hit, but to ensure that production and exports is not severely reduced. Interventions included export bans, export incentives on certain products, and reduction in import tariffs. Critical COVID-19 related goods are more likely subjected to government interventions. With global value chains likely to be disrupted, governments may further liberalize the imports of intermediate goods in order to ensure a continuous supply of inputs. The interventions studied on the import side include the liberalization of import tariffs, import tariff quotas that allow imports below a certain threshold quantity duty-free, while imposing tariffs on the amount exceeding that threshold, and finally, internal taxes on imports. The largest beneficiary of import liberalization was the intermediate goods of electronics. RTAs play an important role to improve trading relationships between countries. RTAs between various trading partners are more likely to be important for global value chains that rely on the supply of goods crossing borders multiple times, such as that of electronic goods. Trade of electronic goods is likely to be more dependent upon RTAs than the trade of textile goods, which includes footwear and apparel. With the prominence of NTMs increasing globally, it is likely that a significant proportion of goods exported from Asia-Pacific countries will face NTMs. Although certain NTMs can be trade restrictive, NTMs can play an important role to ensure quality of goods imported, as well as harmonization of standards across countries. These measures become ever so increasingly important during a pandemic. A greater proportion of exports of intermediate electronics are the most likely to destinations with which the exporter has negotiated an RTA, while the proportion of exports of final textile goods are likely to be the least. A larger proportion of imports of final products tends to flow into Asia-Pacific countries from countries with which they have a RTA. Countries with high levels of LSCI and low levels of closure are more likely to be trading with partners with which they have a RTA. Participation in global value chains involving members with RTAs is slightly high in electrical equipment for exporters reporting higher values of LSCI. the countries in the Asia Pacific region are likely to face high levels of NTMs on their exports. The only group of countries that report low indices for the NTMs are those with high workplace closure, but low levels of LSCI, given that they have a RTA with their trading partner. Their trade is likely to be relatively minimal though. So competition in exports from countries with low levels of closure that continue to produce their goods can threaten the exports from countries with high levels of closure, resulting in the former capturing the share of the latter, given the importers are seeking products produced efficiently and at lower costs of production. Exports of products for which countries with high levels of workplace closure report a fair share of more than 1 or equal to 1, where RCA is greater than or equal to 1, may be threatened by competition from countries reporting not only a fair share of more than 1, but also a relatively favorable unit value of exports. This eliminates products in which the exporters do not have a RCA greater than or equal to 1. The trade-weighted average unit value of exports is calculated for products originating from countries with high levels of closure. How much value is generated in countries with low levels of workplace closure from such products that can compete with products from markets reporting high levels of closure? Right? This is what we will ask, and the result will be in the next slide. Exports of electronics are the most prominent against the set of products that are more likely to capture the export market share from countries with high levels of workplace closure. The trend in exports of intermediate products to countries with the FTA suggests that it is an important instrument to promote global value chains. This has been reported earlier in the slides. So I conclude my presentation with the following summary. Although the impact of COVID-19 pandemic was widespread across the Asia-Pacific region, countries with higher levels of workplace closure and maritime connectivity may report different implications. Countries reporting higher levels of connectivity are likely to report greater levels of trade flows. However, countries with lower levels of workplace closure reported larger fall in exports than countries with higher levels of workplace closure. With different sectors involved in varying rates of global value chain participation, the impact is likely to differ across sectors. Trade of electronic goods are likely to be more exposed to shocks than the trade of textile goods, mainly due to the volume of trade and the higher value of foreign inputs through use of intermediate goods. However, exports of electronic goods also provides significant potential for countries with low levels of closure to capture market share of countries with high levels of closure. Trade of intermediate goods are likely to be more dependent upon RTAs than trade of final goods. The same can be said for trade of electronic goods compared to textile goods. I will end with a set of recommendations. First, I recommend improved trade facilitation and coordination across borders, adopting better practices at the border to ensure goods pull through more effectively. Second, priorities are likely to differ across sectors. Trade of electronic goods are likely to dominate global value chains, and sector-specific measures will be necessary to reduce the disruptions in supply chains. It is crucial that countries considering entering into multilateral arrangements such as WTO's Information Technology Agreement. Third, the production stages of goods traded also matter for multilateral negotiations of RTAs. Imports of intermediate goods of textile products are more dependent on RTAs than the exports of textile products. This will be critical in ensuring the effectiveness of RTAs. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Adil. And that's the information from the Commission papers on how supply chains have been affected by COVID-19. Now, let's moving on to focus on the online trade. E-commerce, as we all know, was one of the on the rise even before COVID-19, but how the pandemic made it very compulsory that if any business want to survive in this period, they have a real chance to do it online. That's the only way to go. Is this statement true? We're gonna find the true answer. Let's hear it from our two speakers on this matter together. It is an honor to have Associated Professor Dr. Takashi Tsukamoto from Meiji University and Ms. Kanupriya Dua from the International College of Liberal Arts, Yamanashi Gakuin University.
Hello, my name is Takashi Tsukamoto. First of all, I would like to thank the International Institute for Trade and Development for giving us this opportunity to write a paper on e-commerce in India and Japan, and also giving us this wonderful opportunity to present a paper at the Trade and Development Regional Forum 2021. Today, together with my colleague Kanupriya Dua, I'm going to present a paper on the e-commerce in India and Japan. If you look at today's world, the number of the retail e-commerce sales stands at around 4.3 trillion US dollars. The trend of e-commerce is growing, with the average monthly visit to e-commerce sites at about 22 billion US dollars. So the dynamic potential of the e-commerce market has been growing. In our presentation, we provide an analytical picture of this dynamic e-commerce market by looking at two cases. One in India, which is a growing e-commerce market, and Japan, which is a relatively mature e-commerce market. In our study, we try to provide analysis of the market share of e-commerce in India and Japan, historical developments and challenges in those e-commerce markets, and lessons learned from these two experiences. Our presentation, first part of the presentation will look at the case of Japan, and the later part of the presentation will look at the case of India. Japan is one of the most developed markets for online shopping in the world. It is the world's third largest e-commerce market, followed by China and the United States. The e-commerce market in Japan has grown rapidly and dramatically, particularly in the last decade. The Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry estimated that the size of the e-commerce market in Japan in 2010 was about 7,778 billion yen, which was the 2.8% of the total retail sales. But in 2018, it increased to 17,984 billion yen, which was about 6.2% of the total retail sales. Japanese e-commerce market is a place of open competition. There are a number of e-commerce companies participating in this market. For example, we have a giant firm like Amazon, and the Japanese firms like Rakuten, ZOZOTOWN, and Mercari. But the Japanese e-commerce landscape is predominantly led by the two players, that is to say, Amazon Japan, which opened its business in Japan in 2000, and Rakuten, which first launched its business in 1997. By looking at the history of e-commerce development in Japan, Japan was regarded as being late and comparatively unenthusiastic in joining the dot-com revolution. But e-commerce has been one of the potential areas in Japan's economic landscape, particularly after the collapse of the bubble economy in the late 1990s. And the Japanese government has carefully developed its information industry strategy throughout history. The government has established the three major strategies since 2000. The first strategy was called E-Japan, and the second one was called U-Japan, and U means ubiquitous. These two strategies focused on the infrastructure and hardware of information technology. The third strategy was called I-Japan, and this strategy tried to promote Japan's long-term economic development through the application of digital technology. In the case of Japan, the Japanese government has often and proactively intervened in the e-commerce market, particularly since the late 1990s. For example, the government tried to secure fairness and transparency. In this case, we have the law, which is called the Act on Improving Transparency and Fairness of Digital Platforms. This act was introduced last year and tightened the regulations of major e-commerce firms operating in Japan. This law required those operators to report on their business activities to the Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry every year. There are obstacles of accessing the e-commerce market in Japan. Japanese consumers are concerned with the insufficient protection of personal information, and because of this, many of the consumers decided not to join the e-commerce market. They see a kind of huge gaps between the real world and virtual world, and they are still skeptical about the security infrastructure of online payment. Obviously, the government are trying to ease their concerns, but the operational side has also tried to improve the accessibility to the e-commerce market. For example, in Japan, we have the convenience stores. And those convenience stores try to help consumers and the customers, obviously, have access to e-commerce. And there are more than 58,000 convenience stores in Japan. And at those convenience stores, consumers have access to e-commerce terminals without even using their PCs and without even using their credit cards. To sum up the section of Japan, it is fair to say that the Japanese government, the state, has promoted accessibility to and competitiveness of the e-commerce market in Japan. The Japanese government determined the direction of economic development, and they established the national strategies which help integrate e-commerce as an important area of long-term economic development.
Our paper endeavors to give the reader a sneak peek into the dynamic e-commerce platforms that are taking Japan and India by storm. We have compiled pie charts specially to visually represent how this looks like as of mid-August 2021. The reason we are saying the dates so specifically is that, especially when it comes to India, the e-commerce fight is so closely fought that by the time you read our paper, Amazon might overtake Walmart-backed Flipkart. What's more, there might be new laws put in place. That's why when it comes to India, we thought it wise to say, watch this space. We've gone into a bit of historical detail to bring the reader up to speed so that the reader can truly understand that starting in 1991, India's fortune turned for the better. Before that, it was truly a poor nation. The path of economic liberalization that started in 1991 was a prerequisite to get $1.5 billion from the International Monetary Fund. Pre-1991 India is very hard to visualize now for the uninitiated. It was a socialist-style India, a policy India shortly adopted after independence, looking at the former USSR. So with the collapse of the USSR and the raging Gulf War, with these two things happening almost simultaneously, USSR was India's major trading partner. And with its collapse in 1991, and with the fact that because of the Gulf War, all the Indian workers who were working in the Gulf could no longer send their wages back home, these two were one of the biggest things that contributed towards the process of liberalization. Liberalization continued till 2004. By this time, most of India's command and control centers were dismantled, so more foreign trade finally opened up. Thus, the economy grew a lot faster. Started in 2003 for the next 15 years, that means from 2003 to roughly 2018, India grew by almost 7.5% on average. The primary reason that the Indian economy took off are too numerous to enumerate, but one of the major reasons was the IT sector. So, as I just mentioned a few seconds ago, India liberalized in 1991. That's when the process began. So within a very short span of time, by 2007, India's IT sector was already posting a revenue of almost $23.5 billion. And by the time it was 2018, so almost one decade after that, the same sector was actually bringing in about $167 billion. Most of India's so that was the one reason that I just enumerated, which was the IT sector. Another big thing which has contributed a lot towards India's growth, exponential growth, has been India's population. It's both a curse and a blessing, of course. So blessing in the sense that most of India's 1.3 billion people are under the age of 35, which has helped India buck a very significant trend which rest of Asia is facing. Rest of Asia is facing a very aging population. That's not the case with India. In 2014, the current Prime Minister, his name is Narendra Modi, came to India's helm, and now he's in his second term as the Prime Minister of the country. So both the times when he came into power, he of course promised a lot of employment. That's one of the biggest challenges in India right now. After he came into power, he took several steps especially when it comes to the economy. One of the biggest steps that he took, this was in 2017, was something called demonetization. So he did demonetization under the impression that it would help with two things. Number one, that it would help combat black money, which is a major problem in India. And another problem that he thought this entire thing will solve would be tax evasion. This will help combat tax evasion. So these were basically the reasons why a demonetization happened. So due to demonetization, 500 and 1,000 rupee notes were taken out of circulation. And what happened was, because of this absence of cash, the Indian middle classes, which starting in the year 1991, and by the time it was 2016, 2017, the Indian middle class had basically ballooned in terms of structure and its affordability. So many millions of people have been lifted from poverty during this time in India, and so many of them millions had joined the middle class. So by this time, when demonetization happens, there's absence of cash. All these middle classes then get pushed towards cashless payments. And how would we do cashless payments? So one of the biggest platforms in India at that time happened to be Paytm, Google Pay, right? So these were the kind of things that most Indian middle classes worked towards, and they started using them. Of course, with that happening, what happened was e-commerce, of course, was able to sink its teeth into the Indian middle class. Now, one must remember that actually the company which started e-commerce in India is definitely not Amazon. It was not even Flipkart. It was a sort of obscure little company back in 1999, which was called FabMart, and later on they changed their name to IndiaMart. So that was an indigenous Indian company that started. Shortly after that, we had eBay in India. Shortly after that, Flipkart started, then Snapdeal. So India's had its fair share of indigenous e-commerce platforms. But in the first 1.5 decade, the rules of the e-commerce platform were not very well made. The government had not stepped in and made very rigorous rules, so not too many rules applied. However, once Walmart came in and actually bought Flipkart, after that foreign direct policy came about. This was in February 2019. And what it effectively did was, if you are a foreign e-commerce platform, you cannot sell certain products in India. especially if those companies have equity in the companies which are selling those products. So that's one of the biggest things that the new FDI rules state. Of course, these rules do not apply to an indigenous Indian e-commerce platform. Now, before I mention the next e-commerce platform, which has been really important in the past 1.5 years in India, I should tell you that something interesting happened. If you look at India's internet connectivity, you would see that most people subscribe to one single platform to get their internet services, which is called Jio. So, and Jio is owned by Reliance Industries, and the person who owns Reliance is basically the richest man in India. His name is Mukesh Ambani. So, he gave out internet data literally for free for 1 year, and that ballooned internet penetration in India. And of course, with that, all the e-commerce platforms in India wanted to sink their teeth into the next million customers. So because of that, India has seen a lot of investment. India has seen investment from Facebook, Alibaba, Amazon, of course. Everyone's fighting to get Indian customers. Tata Industries is also in the game. SoftBank is in the game. So many of these companies have come in. Now, as I mentioned, Jio, Reliance Jio are the biggest internet providers of India. And that actually means they're not only the biggest internet providers in India, they're actually the biggest internet providers in the world. Just because of sheer numbers that India has gives to the world. So the same Reliance Industries actually in the last 1.5 years came up with their own e-commerce platform, which is called JioMart. And that's the one big new e-commerce platform to look out for. Of course, because of the new FDI rules, they would definitely get more Indian customers, because the rules which apply to Amazon and now Walmart will definitely not apply on them or on any other Indian platform. So if someone's thinking of investing in India, probably the next big investment should be with JioMart. So these are the kind of things that our paper looks at, and Sukamoto Sensei and I sort of were trying to look at these kind of issues, not only from an Indian point of view, but of course from a Japanese point of view as well.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kanupriya and Dr. Takashi, for your sneaking information about how e-commerce rise in Japan and India. So it is true that they say the only way to revive doing business right now in this period is to find a way to do it online. Even our seminar, we are doing it online, isn't it? Anyhow, we are going to take a mini break again for 10 minutes, and then our last sections of the day, we're going to come back and see the panel discussion about building resilience while facing COVID-19. In 10 minutes, stay tuned, and then come back to me.
First of all, I would like to convey my most sincere congratulations to ITD for its 20th anniversary. I would like to wish ITD Executive Director, the management team, and all the staff every success in their endeavors and in all their mission activities. Thank you very much.
ผมรู้สึกภูมิใจและก็ยินดีครับที่ได้ทราบว่าปีนี้เป็นปีที่ฉลองครบรอบ 20 ปีของการก่อตั้งสถาบันระหว่างประเทศเพื่อการค้าและการพัฒนาในโอกาสนี้ผมขออวยพรให้บุคลากรทั้งหมดของ ITD ตลอดจนถึงท่านคณะกรรมการผู้บริหารทุกคนมีความสุขมีสุขภาพที่แข็งแรงสามารถทำหน้าที่ตามภารกิจที่ได้ตั้งอกตั้งใจไว้ขอเป็นกำลังใจให้กับการทำงานและขอแสดงความยินดีกับ 20 ปีของการก่อตั้ง ITD ครับ
จากจุดเริ่มต้นของความห่วงใยที่ธนาคารออมสินได้ส่งมอบให้คนไทยผ่านการปลูกฝังวินัยแห่งการออมผลักดันทุกความมุ่งมั่นให้มีความหมายและสานต่อทุกฝันเพื่อส่งต่อความอุ่นใจในทุกช่วงเวลาสุขสันต์วันเกิดค่ะพ่อขอบคุณที่ให้เราได้เติบโตเคียงคู่และอยู่เคียงข้างคุณตลอดมา108 ปีธนาคารออมสินธนาคารเพื่อสังคม
บริษัทปตท.สำรวจและผลิตปิโตรเลียมจำกัดมหาชนหรือปตท.สผ.บริษัทคนไทยที่มุ่งมั่นสำรวจและผลิตพลังงานจากแหล่งก๊าซธรรมชาติและน้ำมันดิบมากกว่า3 ทศวรรษภายใต้แนวคิดองค์กรแห่งความยั่งยืนเราสำรวจความมุ่งมั่นผลิตความเชี่ยวชาญเราสำรวจโอกาสผลิตธุรกิจที่ถูกต้องโปร่งใสเราสำรวจความสุขผลิตคุณภาพชีวิตทั้งหมดนี้เพื่อสารประโยชน์ร่วมกับผู้มีส่วนได้ส่วนเสียทุกฝ่ายภายใต้วิสัยทัศน์ Energy Partner of Choice เพราะความมั่นคงด้านพลังงานคือจุดเริ่มต้นในการขับเคลื่อนของทุกชีวิตเราจะก้าวต่อไปด้วยกันเพื่อพลังงานที่ยั่งยืนปตท.สผ. Energy Partner of Choice
First of all, I would like to convey my most sincere congratulations to ITD for its 20th anniversary. I would like to wish ITD Executive Director, the management team, and all the staff every success in the
Welcome back again, everyone, to our virtual seminar. This is the last session on recharging Asia, inclusive growth and sustainable development amidst post-pandemic world. Unfortunately, I have to pass this forum to another guy, so I have some time to rest. Having heard from all the experts about how COVID-19 has reshaped our way of global economic works, now we will move on to panel discussion to talk about what we can do right now while the pandemic is still going on and how to build the resilience or to adapt ourselves while facing the COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have the Executive Director of the ITD who will be here to do the moderator duty for me. Please welcome Dr. Thanarat Kuwaranyu Thiangkamon.
Thank you very much, Kunta people.
Thank you to you too.
And good afternoon to all of the participants and watching from the home, whether online or via live tube, YouTube, and Facebook. Again, I have to say good afternoon, namaste, konnichiwa, and ni hao to all the panelists and discussants today. Now, due to the lack of the internet connection from India, we still have 6 of the gurus of economic and trade development, right, from all of the international institutes all over the world. Here we have, right, Dr. Giuseppe Busini from the European Union to Thailand, Kun Edwin Sakatan Jr. from the U.S. Embassy, Bangkok, and Professor Ni Yuezhi from China. Yep. And we also have 3 discussants today, right, who will give the case study of the COVID resilience from the experience from the 3 countries. First of all, we have Dr. Suthat Seth Bunsang, the former Deputy Director of Secretary General of ASEAN, right? Dr. Lak Volakit Pokachon, the President of the Exim Bank, Thailand, and Mr. Kitami So, Director of JETRO, Bangkok. Okay, thank you very much. I will pass on to the first panelist to give the point of view toward the COVID resilience. Please, Dr. Giuseppe Busini, this is your turn now. Thank you very much. Okay, maybe Mr. Busini, you turn off your mic, or please check your microphone, please. We cannot still.
I trust that you should.
Good now. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I apologize. My microphone was off. I was saying that first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting us. Very warm sawadee and good afternoon to everybody. I'm very grateful for having the opportunity of giving you an overview of the European Green Deal in this panel, which is our compass to achieve resilience and ensure a sustainable economic recovery, also to the benefit of EU trading partners. First of all, I think it's useful to give you a few details on what the European Green Deal is. It was announced in December 2019, so before the COVID-19 pandemic started, and it is a policy strategy. It's an idea of economy, of society that the European Union wants to implement in the near future across all policy areas to transform the EU into a fair and prosperous society with a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. The main overarching objective is to turn the European Union into the first climate-neutral continent by 2050, and to also to decouple its economic growth from resource use. And this can only be done by jointly addressing the global climate and environmental challenges, by materializing our shared international commitments in the field of sustainability into concrete actions, and also, which is very important for the business world, also by turning these challenges into opportunities. Now, the unprecedented crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic has not changed the ambition of the EU Green Deal. If I may say, it has made it even more indispensable. The climate emergency is escalating. We see everyday examples of how bad this is becoming. Recent tropical storm in Laos, for instance, unprecedented floods in Germany and Belgium, wildfires raging in Greece, in the US, China. We see every day that the need to tackle climate change is increasingly indispensable. So through the EU Green Deal, we have these ambitions to bounce forward by repairing the short-term damage of the crisis, while also focusing on investment and reforms that support the green and digital transitions, as well as economic and social resilience. More in detail, what is the Green Deal about? Well, first of all, it implies investing in environmentally friendly technologies, in supporting industrial innovation, rolling out cleaner, cheaper, and healthier forms of private and public transport, decarbonizing the energy sector, and last, but certainly not least, also ensuring buildings are more energy efficient. Where are we now? What is being done to turn this vision into reality? Let me just mention something that was adopted very recently, 1 month ago, on the 14th of July 2021. The EU adopted the so-called Fit for 55 package, which is a bunch of proposals that broaden further the decarbonization of Europe's economy, with an intermediate landmark of net reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55%, hence the name, by 2030, compared to 1990 levels. This is extremely important, and it will be implemented, especially through, for instance, new emission trading systems, including the extension to new sectors, buildings, transport among them, and the tightening of the existing EU emission trading system, aiming at lowering the overall emission cap even further, increase its annual rate of reduction. Another very important thing that will be measures that will be adopted concern the decarbonization of the transport sector through a faster rollout of low emission transport modes, for instance, and the supporting infrastructure, as well as support of sustainable fuels and zero emission technologies in aviation and maritime transport. Next, another important measure that will be adopted is the implementation of a carbon border adjustment mechanism that will put a carbon price on imports of a targeted selection of products to make sure that our ambitious climate goals do not lead to carbon leakage. Therefore, I mean, it's not kind of more polluting production and kind of industrial methods are just transferred far away from Europe. So this will encourage industry outside the EU and our international partners to take steps in the decarbonization of the economy as they have similarly committed already at the international level. Otherwise, their products will not be very competitive any longer. Last but not least, Fit for 55 includes other initiatives towards an increased use of renewable energy, for instance, increased target to produce 40% of energy from renewable sources by 2030, and to promote energy efficiency. And also another important thing for the business world, to align taxation policies with the European Green Deal objectives. Now, what is the impact of all this that is being done at home in Europe on Asian developing economies? It might be too early to quantify precisely the impact of EU policies on the developing economies in Asia. However, it is important to acknowledge that the impact in the long term will depend on how fast each country adapts to clean and green technologies and sustainable business practices. The quicker, the more positive the impact on their economies will be. What we also need to acknowledge is that the EU Green Deal, its sub-policies and legislative proposals are part of shared commitments taken by the international community to urgently address the global climate crisis. So not only the EU, but many other partners, many other developed economies are engaging concretely on a green sustainability path. Let me just mention, for instance, what's being done in Japan or Korea, to name just a couple. Therefore, beside the urgency of addressing the environmental crisis, there's the urgency for all countries to adapt and factor in these changes within their own policies and economic reform plans. This is extremely important for us because what we see is an alternative between investing right now or paying the price down the road, which might be very hefty. Not adapting to this new reality could deprive countries around the world from massive business opportunities and would put them further at odds economically and would hamper their sustainable economic growth. The business opportunity for Asian economies would be missed. Pushed by the Green Deal, EU business will inevitably go greener, will be developing new technologies, and will be looking after new business partners. They will no longer engage in foreign markets where the compliance with international principles in the field of sustainability is neglected or considered not so important. So this leads me to a second and final point I wanted to make about hampering the sustainable economic growth of the country. These countries could be left outside these forward-looking business deals. At the same time, not setting ambitious and compelling sustainability objectives would send us back to untenable economic development models, further exhausting the planet, its resources, and most importantly, its people. Would have a very negative impact on our environment, on people, with some of the consequences that we have already been seeing for some time now. There's no future in this, and the European Union is really adamant on the implementation of these reforms to grant a greener planet and a greener future for everybody. Of course, this road to recovery is uneven. It's not always a linear process, but this is why it is essential for the European Union to ensure an inclusive transition by relentlessly supporting the economic partners in need. I think this is a very important point because the EU is ensuring an inclusive transition internally through the Just Transition Mechanism, a fund that is part of the Green Deal. But this is being done domestically, but we also have a very important bunch of actions that are being implemented at the international level with our partners, because we want to support our partners to implement these reforms, and hence our from now onwards our development cooperation with third countries will see not less than 25% of its budget devoted to environmental and climate issues. So this was what I wanted to say as an introduction, but of course I'm more than happy to intervene further in the course of the discussion. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Giuseppe from the European Union to Thailand. And your point of view is a focus on the quick recovery, but please do not forget about the Green Deal and the SDG goals too. Thank you very much. Okay, we will pass the discussion to Mr. Edwin C. Secretary Jr. from the Counselor of Economic Affairs from U.S. Embassy, Bangkok. Please give your point of view toward this discussion. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and hello to my fellow panelists. I look forward to hearing your views and the discussion that will ensue. I'd like to make a few points about U.S. economic policy in the region and the Build Back Better World initiative. But first, I want to highlight the visit to the region of Vice President Kamala Harris, who is in Singapore today and will move on to Vietnam soon. Her visit emphasizes the importance that the United States places on ASEAN and other regional partners and their essential role in the Indo-Pacific region. These regional partnerships are critical to America's prosperity, and one of the most important objectives of the Vice President's trip is to strengthen our partnerships and deepen our strategic relationships in the region. The Vice President's meetings will include focused discussion with her counterparts on cooperation on global health and COVID-19, especially on the importance of working together to end this pandemic, but also to prevent future pandemics. From day one of his administration, President Biden has been clear about both the importance of vaccinating the American people against COVID-19 and also our commitment to being an arsenal of vaccines for the world. That is why we have already given more than 23 million doses of the COVID vaccine to countries in Southeast Asia, including 1.5 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine of a planned 2.5 million dose donation to Thailand, and over $158 million in emergency COVID-19 assistance. And I should add that these vaccines are provided free of charge with no political or economic strings attached. The bottom line, if we want to end this pandemic, we both have to protect American people and do more to vaccinate people across the globe. Both are critical objectives. We're already making progress in protecting Americans as we help others around the globe. In just the months of June and July, the US administered 50 million shots in the United States, and we also shipped more than 100 million shots to other countries. What that means is that America has shipped more vaccines to other countries than every other country has donated combined. And we're not going to stop there. During the coming months of fall and early winter, we expect to give an additional $100 million booster shots in the United States, donate more than 200 million additional doses to other countries, on our way to donating more than 600 million vaccines. And this builds on broader US leadership on the pandemic response, including our commitment to COVAX, to which the US is the largest contributor. And we urge more countries to fund and donate doses to COVAX so it can help hard-hit low-income countries. Our support for the TRIPS waiver for COVID vaccines at the World Trade Organization. Our Quad partnership is also on track to help produce at least 1 billion doses of COVID vaccine in India for the Asia region by the end of 2022. And also our work to support vaccine manufacturing in Africa, but by providing financing to a South Africa business to bolster its manufacturing capacity to produce more than 500 million doses for Africa. So the United States is delivering on the biggest vaccine commitment around the world and will do more. But we urge the rest of the world to step up and do more too. The United States is committed to helping the global health in this region, not just to keep people healthy, but because enhancing global health security, including ending the COVID-19 pandemic, is crucial to our mutual economic prosperity and economic development. Let me turn briefly now to the Build Back Better World initiative that President Biden announced in June with G7 leaders to help meet the tremendous infrastructure needs of low and middle income countries. President Biden and his G7 partners agreed to launch this new global infrastructure initiative, Build Back Better World, as a values-driven, high-standard, transparent infrastructure partnership to help meet the more than $40 trillion infrastructure needs of the developing world. And these needs have only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Build Back Better World partners will seek to mobilize private sector capital in 4 focus areas: climate, health and health security, digital technology, and gender equity and equality, with catalytic investments from our respective development financed institutions. The Biden administration also expects this initiative to complement domestic U.S. infrastructure investments and create new opportunities to demonstrate U.S. competitiveness abroad, as well as jobs at home. Let me briefly highlight the guiding principles of Build Back Better World. It will be values-driven, infrastructure development carried out in a transparent and sustainable manner, financially, environmentally, and socially, which will lead to better outcomes for recipient countries and communities. It will model good governance and strong standards. Our efforts will be guided by high standards and principles related to the environment and climate, labor and social safeguards, transparency, financing, construction, anti-corruption, and other areas. It will be climate friendly. Investments will be made in a manner consistent with achieving the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And this goal is step in step with the Biden administration's greater efforts and focus on climate change. It will seek strong strategic partnerships, infrastructure that is developed in partnership with those whom it benefits will last longer and generate more development impact. It will mobilize private capital through development finance. Available funding and financing approaches are inadequate to address the tremendous infrastructure funding gap, so we will augment the development finance tools at our disposal to support a significant increase in private capital to address infrastructure needs. And finally, it will enhance the impact of multilateral public finance. It will work with the international financial institutions to enhance their catalytic impact and increase the mobilization of capital, both public and private, needed for impactful and sustainable infrastructure investment. We look forward to working with our partners in the region to make this ambitious initiative a success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edwin. You give very fruitful point of view about the COVID-19. It is about the World War V. We in World War I and II, right, we fight to each other. But this time, the World War V, we fight with the virus. And your point of view is that we have to got shot from the vaccine, either US citizen or global citizen, to end the war of the virus and to continue the economics. Thank you very much again. Okay, I will pass on the discussion to Professor Ni Weizhi from from China. Please give me your point of view toward the building resilience in the COVID-19 situation. Please, thank you very much. Okay. Okay. Maybe Professor Ni have some connection problem. So, okay. Thank you very much. Ni hao. Okay. We will pass on the discussion to Professor Ni Weizhi. Okay, please give your point of view toward the COVID-19 and how to building the quick recover or resilient. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to thank moderator and IDD provide me this chance to exchange my opinion with all of you. I would like to talk about 2 issues. One is about BRI, and another one is about e-commerce in rural of China. About BRI, how to help and support the economic development of the developing countries and the LDCs. General Secretary Xi Jinping of CPC has said the purpose of proposing the BRI and AIIB is to deepen cooperation between countries and achievement common development. Since the BRI were put forward in 2013 until June this year, China has signed cooperation documents with 140 countries. Most of these countries are developing countries or LDCs. In order to help and support these countries' economic development, China has focused on the following tasks. First, strengthening infrastructure. According to China's development experience, infrastructure construction is the foundation of economic development. There is a familiar saying in China that is, if you want to reach, first build roads. Show the core contents of the built and the road as to establish a better infrastructure, interconnection network between these countries, including transportation, power, and internet as act. So far, most of the key projects implemented in the Belt and Road are related to the infrastructure. The AIIB now have invested a total 108 projects with total of $22 billion, mainly concentrated in energy, 30%, transportation, 20%, water resources, 24%, urban construction, 6%. This infrastructure have played an important role in promoting the economic development of relevant countries. Secondly, build industrial zones. China's development experience also prove that industrialization is an important way for developing countries to achieve economic development and modernization. Therefore, the One Belt and One Road also promote industrial development through the construction of industrial zones as greater significance for regulating the industrialization of these countries. The third issue is about the development of e-commerce in rural of China. Indeed, in China, in recent years, e-commerce have expanded from cities to rural areas. The numbers of Alibaba Taobao Village cluster of e-tailers rose from 212 in 2014 to 5,425 until June 2020. I think to the other developing countries, there are some lessons to learn from. One is to promote rural internet construction. As of the end of 2020, the number of international users in rural areas has reached 309 million, accounting for 31.3% of the total international user. Secondly, the strong support of the government. Although there are physical and digital network in many cities and regions. It may still require a lot of investment to make e-commerce reach more remote areas. In the past 10 years, China's government, through a series of government support policies, rural development plan have played a key role in the construction of other infrastructure. In terms of digital infrastructure, China's rural areas have achieved 100% full coverage of electric supply, and 70% of the population own smartphone, with 75% 4G network rate. So the government has also played a very important role in building the logistic network. China now has 2.6 million miles of roads, all of which can lead to remote areas. Public postal service can be provided at low and fixed prices, allowing buyer and seller to use e-commerce even in remote rural areas. In some countries and regions, although the governments also play an important role, the price of logistics and transportation often become a bottleneck for the development of e-commerce. Certainly, farmers could obtain credit support through platforms or intermediaries. That's all my answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ni. You mentioned like both physical via like BRI, right? And digital via the e-commerce to recover or quick get back from the COVID-19. This is like the two factors that you mentioned, how to build the resilient recover from COVID-19. Thank you very much. And may I pass the session to our three discussants. They will give like us about the case study of the COVID resilience, right? We will start with Dr. Suthat Seth Bunsang, right? He is the former Deputy Director of ASEAN. Okay. Thank you very much, ครับ อาจารย์ Please give us your view toward the COVID-19 resilience or the case study that you have experienced or have like heard from the network that you have. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, we will wait for the voice from Dr. Suthat. So we have now used the headset, right? Okay.
All right.
Okay, good. I heard you already, Dr. Suthat. Thank you very much. Okay, please go on.
Right. I think the technology is moving ahead of me. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to this very important group of audience. I was a former Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN, and we spent a lot of time coordinating at that point of time, and that was about 20, 30 years ago, building up the ASEAN Free Trade Area. That was in the early 1990s. The world was so bright and everything is possible for ASEAN and Southeast Asia, then it looks a lot different now after the pandemic. The pandemic has caused a lot, loss of life. I think the number I'm looking at now is close to 10 million deaths. The death toll is very high. And also a huge economic loss around the world. A lot of jobs, a lot of people unemployed. And, we do not know how many people die because of the economic woe and difficulty that are caused by the COVID in the past 2 years. But I'm sure that they are not a small number. They say that we should not waste a crisis. In every crisis, not only there's opportunity, but there are a lot of lessons that we have to learn from it before we move forward. The big lesson that I think we see from analyzing this death toll of the COVID is inequality. The pandemic can kill people, but I think if you analyze it carefully, then you see that the deaths are more in the poorer countries. And within this country, within all the countries, the poorer population are affected more than the middle class and the rich. So clearly, pandemic is not neutral. And in fact, like other technology, the pandemic, all technologies are also not neutral. We talk about digital technology, we talk about e-commerce. It is not neutral. Some group of people benefit more than the other. And I think this is one of the problems that we need to address before we can really move on and find ourselves a better and brighter, more secure future. We should not walk away from this crisis without really addressing and really put our head and mind into resolving the inequality issues. It is not just income. We can see this. Access to healthcare is very clear that it is biased. In fact, if you look further down, all other things that are important in the recovery are also very much non-neutral, is biased. You're talking about food security, which is the next area that we probably can cause a huge problem in this world. Just imagine if we have a food crisis, what will happen in this world? Again, you see the same pattern. The rich will have no problem. The poor will have a problem. Rich countries will have not so much problem. Poor countries will have a lot of problem. So if you look at science, well, pandemic is a very good example. The vaccine are discovered or produced in a rich country. There's no production. We have no technology to produce it, not even outside of the key developed countries. So clearly, there's a huge bias in here, and we should not ignore this because it is very serious. We should address it upfront. Digital technology that we talk about the e-commerce. Again, the rich people, the poor people, rich country, poor country. You can see this pattern. So I think this social illness is actually as severe as the pandemic, and we should not really ignore what needs to be done. Early on, we heard that we talk about the recovery. We cannot just go ahead and live the life the way we had before the crisis, this pandemic. It will be unfair to us as ourselves and to the next generation of people. it is quite scary to think what kind of world are we, this generation of people. I'm 70 years old. I have to think of the next generation. I don't have a long life and long time to live, but next generation and the next subsequent generation, what kind of world do we want to leave them? And certainly we talk about climate change, environment. Again, if you look at the impact of the climate change, it's also very much unequal. Again, it will hit the rich less than hitting the poor. So how do we address this in our recovery process? So before we embark on this recovery and start installing all this new technology that we had before the crisis, we have to think a little bit of how this recovery process can be really, the word we always use is more inclusive. But how can we really make it more inclusive when everything we do the system is so biased? There was a good example that happened in this crisis. Yesterday, I was listening to a presentation from a senior officers from Indonesia in one of these ASEAN agricultural senior officers meeting. He was telling that in Indonesia, during the crisis, a lot of people, Indonesian, they have to go home.
Yeah.
In Indonesian word, they call pulang kampung. And it is this group of these people that actually are now using new technology, adopting new technology to produce food. When they go back, the illness forced them, they don't have money. They have to grow herbs. They have to eat. They grow vegetables. So there are a lot of innovations that are going in there to help the survival of these people. I think this kind of thing needs to be nurtured and find its way into a newer system that we are about to build. I certainly think that this kind of thing, among ASEAN countries, among the middle class economy, we should actually work together more. We do not have to depend just on the developed countries to hand the technology to us. The social structure, the social organization that we have are the big asset that we have. Helping each other and then rebuild a new society, rebuild the world that is probably less materialistic and more careful with the life of each other.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Suthat, your point of view is very, very useful. I have heard from the African friend that one death of the elder equal to the loss of one big library. So during this time, we have lost more than 10 million libraries already. Okay, so after that economic loss, we also have the human capital loss too during the pandemics. And also, Dr. Suthat also mentioned about the innovation during the crisis. For example, the food and agricultural innovation. Thank you very much. May I pass on the discussion to Dr. Rak Warakit Pokathon, the president of the Exim Bank. Please give us your case study or point of view how to recover from the COVID-19. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. สวัสดีครับ Good afternoon, distinguished speakers and participants. COVID-19 hits Thailand very hard and damaged our economic landscape badly. Exim is no exception. It has transformed the way we think, the way we work, the way we act, and finally, the way we carry on our business operations. And finally, we have adopted the role of Thailand Development Bank in order to play with the challenges. We redefined our roles as Thailand Development Bank under what we call dual-track policy. Thai economy has been struck in the middle income trap for a period of time. Moreover, structure of entrepreneurs has also been controversial since SMEs have a very large number, but their role have had less impact on Thai's economy. Therefore, Exim Bank has set a new direction to restructure the country's economy. Exim Bank will implement a policy under the dual-track policy, highlighting a clear goal to dream big and achieve bigger towards being Thailand Development Bank, which serves as a government mechanism for national development. In addition, Exim Bank will be leaving no small players behind under a scheme of one-stop trading facilitator for SMEs in order to build new SME exporters. We aim to promote from 1% of Thai SME exporters to 10% by the end of 2024. For the first angle, as development bank, Exim Bank is ready to move towards being Thailand Development Bank under dual-track policy towards the four strategy. The first, renovate Thai industry towards future growth so they can recover and move forward. Exim Bank is ready to be the buffer to support industrial entrepreneurs suffering from the crisis, such as airline industry, and to be a catalyst to increase market attractiveness. Moreover, it will attempt to recover the financial market by offering assistance and fair interest rates for entrepreneurs. The next one, to build new engine and S-curve industry, especially green, digital, and health or GDH strategy, such as BCG, renewable energy, green and almost green, sustainable digital health technology, as well as industry in EEC area. Also, Exim Bank will support industrial transformation, such as upgrading machinery for productivity improvement, like automation and hygienic factory, and support infrastructure investment, such as high-speed rail, digital and innovation park. The third strategy, we need to enhance Thai exporters and investor competitive potential in both major markets and new frontiers. In major markets, Exim will support potential entrepreneurs who can hardly access financial sources. In case of renewable projects in Japan, for example, Thai entrepreneurs often face funding problems due to the early stage of the project from commercial bank in Japan cannot yield the lending. Exim Bank therefore took a step in providing financial support to Thai entrepreneurs during those early stages. And after the project start full operation and can begin selling power commercially, Thai investor may choose to use our source of fund or lower their costs from other commercial banks in Japan. In New Frontier, Exim provides risk hedging facility and pave the way for Thai entrepreneurs to New Frontiers market that have potential and investment needs in manufacturing industry, energy, infrastructure, and urban development. Last but not least, we act as G2G machinery, bridging the project of cooperation between Thai and overseas governments, especially in neighboring countries, since Exim has always been a part of supporting investment projects under the government policy. It is expected to create benefit in three dimensions. First, to improve the well-being of people in neighboring countries, increase the wealth of neighboring countries so we as a Thai businesses can grow accordingly. Last but not least, we strengthen the relationship between Thailand and neighboring countries. This will pave the way for Thai entrepreneurs to quickly settle down in neighboring countries, and thus we can operate business smoothly. Last but not least, the latter angle as one-stop trading facilitator. We operate under 3B policy. First, we boost the knowledge by training and incubating export literacy and related contents to Thai SMEs. Secondly, we boost the liquidity with the total financial solution through the business cycle from the start to the stop. Last but not least, we boost the potential by improving business and innovation as well as technology from the cooperation between our partners such as Ministry of Industry and the Thailand Productivity Institutes. If the world is changing, we need to change with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rak. You have a very, very determinant goal to increase the export of SME from 1% to 10% within 3 years. So without the cooperation from many organizations and investment and bank, we cannot do that. And may I pass on the discussion to the last one from the JETRO, the director of JETRO Bangkok, Kun Kitami So. Please give your view about the case study about the resilience of COVID.
Yes.
From building the resilience from COVID-19. Maybe you can give us the point of view like, from the Japanese point of view, our Japanese business. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Introduce me. My name is Kitami from the JETRO Bangkok office. And we are a governmental agency to promote the Japanese companies' investments or trade between Japan and all over the world. This is my great honor to present here. And today I would like to introduce you to how Japanese companies take action for supply chain resilience. And can you share my next slide? Yes, and this slide shows how many Japanese farms and the production base in ASEAN. You can see the left table. This is the number of Japanese farms in 2020. In ASEAN, around 9,000 Japanese affiliate farms are there, and in China, there are 7,000 companies. And the light graph shows manufacturing companies in each country. You can see around 3,500 manufacturing companies in ASEAN in 2020. And this number is increased in this decade, and it's increased higher rate compared with China. So we can say that China and ASEAN are very, very important manufacturing production bases for Japanese companies. And next slide, please. And this slide shows the supply chain of Japanese companies in Asia. Please see the left graph. You see the blue part are local procurements, and the red is ASEAN, and the green one is Japan, and the orange one is China. So almost 90% of procurement source is ASEAN or China or Japan. And please see the right graph. This shows the sales market of Japanese companies in Asia. So you can see that Asian market dominates almost 90%. So if the supply chain disruption would happen in Japan or China or ASEAN, it will have a huge impact on Japanese companies. So however, these days, please, next slide, please. Yes, however, these days, the factory operation has been quite difficult for Japanese companies. They are facing a lot of problems due to COVID-19. The company must continue the operation with COVID prevention in factory, but they have activities which are unable to adapt to work from home, and vaccination is insufficient, and they need mental care also. And on the supply side, supply chains are disrupted by the cluster of lockdown at suppliers, and it becomes difficult to procure parts and raw materials, especially semiconductors. In exporting process, logistics costs are rapidly increased. And also paper-based trade procedure become an obstacle for working from home. And in headquarters, the support staff will not come from Japan due to the restriction. So next slide, please. Then how a Japanese company think to enhance their resilience? And the left graph is shows the 15 measures are there. And this comes from a questionnaire survey to the Japanese manufacturing companies. And you can see the left graph, the top measure reviewing sales strategy or staff reduction. But please see the red bars. 35% of companies will review their procurement source, and 26% think multiple sourcing, and 8% will review their production base. Then Japanese government launched the program for strengthening the overseas supply chain network through diversification of production base or procurement source. And Vietnam and Thailand are quite popular among Japanese companies for investment. So let me show you the example of this project and the manufacturer of medical supplier and hand soap or automotive parts, etc. And last slide, can you show me? Next slide, please. Yes. And another measures that Japanese companies expect to realize is, can you show the slide, please? Sorry. Okay. Another measure that Japanese companies expect to realize is the digitalization of documentations, and paperwork and signing become an obstacle for working from home. So trade facilitation through digitalization will make companies more resilient, but trade-related documentations still requires paper or original one. So there are many trade-related documentation, and ASEAN member states proceed with digital exchanging through the ASEAN single window. And in Japan, for example, private company consortium Trade World's name takes action to exchange the trade documentation. That's all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kitami. I always love the Japan style of presentation. It is like detailed but easy to understand. I think that your document will be like very helpful for business and entrepreneur in Thailand. And I have heard that how to recover from the document. I think that this is useful for the people to download and study, right? Many details in that, but easy to understand. So last, I will give the panelists to maybe start from Dr. Giuseppe to have like a brief conclusion from the knowledge and the opinion that we have today. May I give you like about 3 to 5 minutes of conclusion or brief to this the panel discussion. Thank you very much. Dr. Giuseppe.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor again. I think I will need even more time because I just wanted to stress again how important for us as European Union is to support resilience and sustainability while we, as my American colleague said, while we build back better. And I'm also very much in agreement with Dr. Sultan when he says that this is definitely a crisis not to be wasted. We need to think very seriously and in very concrete terms how to construct, how to build again. how to make sure that also building on the experience of the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, of the Green Deal, European Green Deal, how to make sure that we avert a looming crisis or a crisis that is already there, because I mean, we shouldn't forget that many of the consequences of climate change, of global warming are already with us. We can already experience, see them, and it is very important to act and to be proactive in fighting climate change and work for sustainability. Otherwise, a crisis might come and might be even much worse than the current pandemic. How we do that? I think I've already gave some hints about that in my intervention earlier on. First of all, we need that countries individually and also at the regional level in coalitions, alliances, work together to implement reforms. Ambitious reforms, we need them. Just the way the European Union has been doing, is doing and will be doing with the implementation of the Green Deal. Another important point that I wanted to reiterate is the readiness and the willingness of the European Union to support partners around the world, both bilaterally and also through region-to-region cooperation, like, for instance, the one that very brilliant cooperation that we have with ASEAN, to make sure that this is everybody's fight and everybody implements reforms and goes towards increased resilience and sustainability. How do we do that? We also have a very important financial means. We have a lot of funds. I said that 25% of our overall cooperation budget will be devoted to supporting our partners in building resilience and sustainability. And this is an important data, in my opinion, if one considers that the European Union and its member states are the most important donors in the world of development cooperation. Last, but definitely not least, is the importance that the important role that must be played by international trade. It is for us a factor of progress. We need trade as a powerful tool to support the green transition, both at the multilateral level, and the European Union is definitely ready to work together with other partners in the context of the WTO, hopefully also with the Asian partners, and also at the bilateral level, because you know that for us, one of the most powerful tools to further reforms and further progress at the global level is our free trade agreements. In that context, we usually cooperate very closely with our partners to trigger and support reforms and all the measures that can be useful in sustainability, in the path to achieving sustainability. So this is what I wanted to say as a conclusion. Please remember that the European Union will always be on the front line when it comes to the fight for sustainability, the fight against climate change, and we are more than happy and willing to cooperate with all our partners at the global level to achieve these fundamental goals for our future and for the next generation's future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Giuseppe. Thank you very much for the information about the fund for every level of the organization and until to the entrepreneur. May I pass the summarize to Mr. Edwin Secretary from U.S. Embassy, Bangkok. So please give me a brief conclusion of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. First of all, I think it's great to have this discussion of how we can recharge Asia. It's just so important to figure out a better way forward. And unfortunately, we're still in the midst of this pandemic. And so we all have to, I think, hope and work hard to make sure that we overcome the pandemic. And, you know, I'm here in Bangkok, and so I'm heartened by some of the lower new case numbers that have come out over the last couple of weeks. So I certainly hope that Thailand is a country that's turned the corner and can kind of overcome, COVID and get its economy back moving again. That's really important as we think about ways to do it better, bringing in resilience and such. I also just want to again highlight that climate change, working on climate change is just absolutely a very, very high priority for the U.S. Administration. President Biden appointed a special presidential envoy for climate change, former Secretary of State John Kerry, and he is very, very active. We are looking forward to cooperating with all of the countries in the region, with ASEAN. I'm sure next year when Thailand, assumes its leadership position in APEC, of working with Thailand. But it's just a crucial thing that we'll be working on, and we look forward to doing that with everyone. And then finally, there's an issue that I didn't get a chance to talk to earlier, but a couple of people have mentioned, and that's supply chains and developing more resilience in supply chains. We still see this happening, in the semiconductor industry. It's impacting the automobile industry. Earlier on during the COVID crisis in America, we had a shortage of all the supplies that we needed to protect people. And so working on resilient supply chains is certainly something that we think is important, and we'll look forward to doing that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Very appreciate. Now, global citizens need to get shot to go on the economics, right? Thank you very much for your point of view on and for the vaccine policy. Okay, and please, Professor Nee, please give us the brief summary to close the very fruitful panel discussion today. Please give your point of view toward the summary of this panel discussion. Thank you very much. Professor Nee, please. The sound is not coming. Dr. Nee, can you turn on your microphone, please?
Okay. No.
We didn't hear you right now.
Okay.
Okay.
Take this chance. I want to emphasize again, either BRI or e-commerce will promote the economic development of developing countries and LDCs countries. So at this stage, infrastructure construction is still the most important work. In the stage of infrastructure construction, the role of the government can't be ignored. How to deal with the relationship between government and visible hand and the market and invisible hand is very important things, I think. Secondly, I want to emphasize is with the rapid development of the digital economy, it's very essential to strengthen cooperation in the digital economic is very important in the future. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nee. And this is come to the closing session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the opinion, information from panelists and discussants. Thank you very much for the attendee both online and offline. Okay, we will have more 2 fruitful days of the regional forum tomorrow and on the 26th. Okay, I thought that the one who want to have the document can download the document we present today online via the ITD website, which is www.itd.or.th.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thanrat. You have done a brilliant job today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Until we meet again.
Yeah, sure.
And thank you to you all my beloved participants for joining us today. But don't forget, our virtual seminar, Recharging Asia, is not done only by today, because we will meet again tomorrow for the second day, and we will focus on ASEAN, our regional tomorrow. So tomorrow, I hope we can meet again at the very same time, before 1 p.m., about 15 minutes. So be prepared. Tomorrow will be very useful, just like today. Thank you so much again for today, and we will meet again tomorrow. Bye-bye.